today is, again, just maybe to summarize Lefebvre. I mean, I find Lefebvre to be one of the most open thinkers. The problem, at least to an Althusser for a Lefebvre, is that Lefebvre is a humanist ultimately, and he's not really hard enough, for the for the revolution, so to speak. Althusser was always thinking, if you will, the revolutionary practice. Lefebvre's thinking it, but maybe thinking it in a very different way, I think in a more poetic way. I mean, Althusser is a hard-boiled theorist, and we could set up an opposition, if you will, between theory and poetics. Mm-hmm. Theoria and poetics, which is an old Greek, an opposition that you see in Aristotle. Even though I don't think he sets it up in an opposition. The theoria means literally to see, to have a vision. Yeah, to see. So when you're theorizing, you're actually, elaborating and elucidating and promoting a vision to theorize. Yeah, and it's a very active way of seeing, very active way. Whereas the poiesis or poiein, or poiesis, let's just do it this way. Poiesis, or the theory of poiesis, or poiein, discourse. This literally means to create and to make. So, in some ways, the creative making is operative in Lefebvre's work, right?
Yeah.
And in Althusser, you're going to see more and more of just this, right? And Althusser's main concern with is we only know of one science, and that is the science of history. So very different approaches to historical materialism in some ways. Even though Althusser writes about it, certainly has a poetic bent. It's not like he's against poetry or against the novel or certainly theater, and he wrote on painting and he wrote on poetry and theater particularly, but much more interested in the theory and the theoretical end, and really elaborating a theory that was totally against the bourgeois ideology. One of the great examples of Lefebvre's use of everyday life is a novelist who was known in France, was very well known in France, a man named Georges Perec. Life, a User's Manual. A very interesting poetic and novelistic life, a user's manual, which was the application, if you will, of some of the everyday life thinking of Henri Lefebvre. They were good friends, and Lefebvre, in his last book on everyday life, wrote very favorably of Perec's work. Perec ended up committing suicide, unfortunately, but was really a first-rate writer and thinker. So anyway, I just wanted to show this at work. That even though Althusser is going to use terms, and these are distinctions that we should know around the left, because Althusser is more in conversation with the Communist Party. Lefebvre has really broken, in my opinion, when he starts to do meta-philosophy, not of course with Marx, but has broken kind of fully with any kind of feeling for the party. I think he's way out there. And as you know, the two most interesting students of Henri Lefebvre are Guy Debord, right? And
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, Guy Debord was a student of, and the other one was Jean Baudrillard, a sociologist. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So these are people that came out of the Lefebvrean tradition. Of Debord and Lefebvre got into it often, etc. Yeah, later, but Society of the Spectacle was an attempt to look at the commodification of vision, the commodification of of everyday life and practice, the spectacle itself and the situationist. So Lefebvre is kind of the thinker behind if you will, or the philosopher behind the situationists. Yeah. Whereas Althusser created a school and groups, right, of which include people we still read today, and all four of them are alive, as far as I know, maybe even all five of the original group. Etienne Balibar, who was, we put out on Facebook their thing on the the Yellow Vest movement, the conversation with Balibar, Negri, and Ludwiga, I forgot her last name, a historian. It was in French, but they did it at the Eiffel Tower. Yeah, and so Balibar is alive. Balibar is born 1940, I think he's 1941. So Balibar is now 77, 76, 77.
And he was associated with, you said, Althusser?
He was Althusser's main person in the beginning. He was only, when he wrote The Basic Problems of Historical Materialism, he was 24 years old. Yeah, kind of a boy. All we wanted to do, Michael, is travel across country on Highway 61 and Route 66. That's all we thought about in France. We wanted just to leave. And then they all got caught up. They had to go back and get their doctorate d'états because they didn't want to take orders from another generation about what they can teach or not. But all they wanted to do is teach and continue to do research. So the original group was, I've talked about this before, Etienne Balibar, yeah, who was The Basic Problems of Historical Materialism, Pierre Macharet, who is now a Spinozaist, has written multiple volumes on Spinoza. His best book, in my opinion, is The Theory of Literary Production. Very interesting book. Lenin reading Tolstoy, a good way of learning what Althusser means by overdetermination and symptomatic reading. Thirdly, a man named Jacques Rancière, who later broke and wrote a book called The Lesson of Althusser, which was a very, interesting critique of Althusser, and now is very prominent in terms of doing work. The art world is taking him up as one of their new angels, right, or theoretical heads. Rancière's on the image, the future of the image, books on cinematography, etc. So Rancière's gone really the way of aesthetics mostly, but also political philosophy. Very good book called The Philosopher and His Poor about Plato that he wrote. So he's become very active over the years. So Balibar is usually at Columbia. Rancière has come to Northwestern and other places in the United States, and both go to the West Coast. The other person was Roger Establé, who also wrote on Hegel and the community of animals, which are the intellectuals, the community of animals in Hegel's phenomenology. So he's trying to, look at that operative. And then on the margins was Alain Badiou, right? Yeah. And so anyway, Rancière wrote on the notion of Marxist critique for the Reading Capital group, and this again is going on. 1965 is when they put out Reading Capital, and they're doing the study of Reading Capital as philosophers, instead of just Reading Capital as a work of economics or a work only of politics or, etc., the standard readings of Marx. So this was the first attempt to really read Marx, reading Marx, and giving strategies of reading, not just synthetic works, summaries, explanations, use of, like the Frankfurt School, a very different approach, if you will, that brought in, Freudian and Lacanian reading strategies to the reading of Capital. Yep. So it was a very different moment. And Alain Badiou, like I said, was the peripheral member. He was the person who did the science and the mathematics. Rancière was an expert on critique, Establé on the Hegel and the intellectuals, Macharet also on the Reading Capital. He had a very interesting essay in there on, I think, on fetish and other things. And like I said, he kind of went the way of doing commentary on Spinoza, 5-volume work, commentary on Spinoza. He's at Lille now. Balibar's at Birkbeck and Columbia, and I think also Irvine, so he has a triple kind of appointment when he goes back and forth. And Rancière does it. And Badiou, as you know, who's the oldest of the generation, is kind of the one who's most in the conversation today about being. Badiou considers himself the great end point of French philosophy, that he is the heir to Derrida, Deleuze, as the final step that begins with Bergson, Sartre, right, phenomenological movement, Deleuze, Derrida, and now Badiou puts the finishing touches. So he considers himself this. He wrote a piece saying that he actually announced who he was. And he has three ontologies: the being an event of the 80s, Logics of World, and a new one called The Immanence of Truth is the third volume of his ontology. And the lectures, are available in French, unfortunately. They're in typescript because they record these things, in France. This is why we have Foucault's lectures in the 70s, Badiou's 80s and 90s and up to today. And so anyway, to make a very long story short, that this really had its high point in the 1960s, and simultaneously Lacan's son-in-law, Jacques-Alain Millier, as well as some other people, became part of the Center for the Epistemological Circle. And this epistemological circle was a very active moment, in the sense that it was the question of, is Marx producing a new knowledge, is really what the question was, and how to do epistemology differently was sort of the question posed. So out of this came a lot of very interesting research papers, etc. And 1964, and we're going to read this probably in May, 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, Lacan's lectures were given, and the people in the Center for the Epistemological Circle, as well as the Althusserians, they were very close. Althusser was the one who gave Lacan, who had no place to teach, right? They were slowly trying to move Lacan out of the loop, gave him gave him a place at the Sorbonne, which was filled. And Lacan was kind of upset. What am I going to do? All the kids are smoking, and they're not supposed to smoke. And Althusser says, well, you're supposed to be the anti-authoritarian, so why don't you figure out something? Finally just everybody kept smoking. Lacan let it be. Yeah. So anyway, to set that stage, Althusser. Now what's going on, obviously, is the French Communist Party is ruled by Waldeck-Rochet, and who's the general secretary, and their philosophers are Roger Garadet, who's a very minor Hegelian, very minor. So this is part of the argument that's going on here, is to try to tell the party you're very stupid in your approach to philosophy. He's trying to set up really what a Marxist philosophy would look like, instead of this very watered down summary of Hegelianism. And really, in a way, this Althusser is also going against any kind of humanistic reading of Marx. Althusser and Adorno are, in my opinion, the two hardest boiled Marxists, in a sense, in different ways, that they have no tolerance for bourgeois humanism, none at all for social democracy, etc. They see right through that, and they're adamant about this throughout. Whereas in a course, right, Gramsci in some senses can be brought back into the humanist fold, etc. Negri doesn't have any humanism either, in a way. That is a real militancy here, in a very different way. We'll try to talk about that. But Althusser is the first of the Marxist tradition, at least in the French Marxist tradition, to take Heidegger's, dictum seriously. We're at the end of philosophy. It's the task of thinking that is at stake as well, although Althusser wants to work this towards a materialist philosophy, a Marxist philosophy, saying there's no such thing yet, but we need to build this. And, without unflinching in terms of, what was a bourgeois deviation in his language or the language of that time. So these were very crucial thinking during this period. So people like Lukács were relegated to footnotes, right, in the Althusserian tradition, because all they deal with, Lukács is only dealing with a totality that's expressive, not structural. He's not really dealing with structural issues or dominance in structures and things like that. The Frankfurt School, they never really engaged in a direct way, but I think again, Adorno was such an anomaly, in the tradition, because his knowledge was so vast, between the music, the cultural theories, the empirical research he did at Princeton, all these things, that they didn't know what to make. I mean, nobody really knew what to make of Adorno in some ways. Yeah.
Feels more like that he's kind of outside all of these
guys. Yeah. Adorno lived in a kind of sphere, very different, although very grounded in his lectures, going on simultaneously as this reading group in Berlin at the Free University are Adorno's lectures on Kant, history and freedom, all of this stuff. The stuff we read was from the 50s. That was a summer course where we read the introduction to dialectics, you remember, with Stanley. And so anyway, but Adorno is in the moment, right, in Berlin. So you can think of the movie in Berlin. Teddy is giving classes to a group of German militants, including Alexander Kluge, right, the filmmaker and theorist, as well as a whole generation, Hans-Jürgen Karl, who died but was one of his best students and out there, Rudi Dutschke, among other, and a whole group of militants. My first exposure is I met a guy who was he was a PhD student in history when I was at Tulane, and a very militant guy. He was a follower of Frankfurt School and Adorno in the history department, and he got framed up on marijuana possession charges. So I loaned the capital to get him out of jail and all this. We became very, very good friends. I just gave it to him. But anyway, he was really framed up on this because they were really trying to go after him because he was an SDS member at Tulane, and they knew it, etc. And at Tulane, there was some militant action. They blew up ROTC. I use that very abstractly. The ROTC building in the Reserve Officers Training Center. And Newt Gingrich was actually one of the writers for the Hullabaloo, which was a 60, 70 page bi-weekly student newspaper. But he advocated for nudity on campus. Newt Gingrich at work, So you have these conflicts. The SDS, a very militant faction, which was connected to the Panthers, in some ways, and also left-wing members of SNCC as well as of the NAACP. One of the best readings I ever saw of Faulkner is Dilsey, the character. I don't know if you know Dilsey. She's the housekeeper for the Compson family, and she's famous for the line, "We will endure." And this friend of mine wrote an essay that was just scathing of that kind of attitude of the Southern black, and really brilliant interpretation of that line and action. So anyway, to make a long story short, the Adorno is in Berlin, doing his stuff. My friend, I have lost touch with him. I don't even know if he's alive, but David Kramer wrote some pieces for New German Critique on the way the Frankfurt School, did history. So you have the Frankfurt School in Berlin, at this time, Althusser and Company in Paris, and these are the two, at least in my mind, outside of the Lefebvre openness and studies of everyday life, the two most fertile and creative ways of dealing with Marx as philosopher, and really taking seriously the anti-humanist or a-humanist moment of the Heideggerian, thinking, in terms of the end of philosophy. Yeah, and Marx, of course, announcing the end of philosophy, which Althusser, I don't know how much you were able to read of this, but, he makes a good point about the German ideology, the end of philosophy, but still the elements. The same thing with capital, etc. So I think this is important too.
Question,
yeah,
what's his beef with alienation?
It's used as a kind of crutch. It's used ultimately as something that doesn't really focus on the movement. Althusser's strategy in reading Capital is to skip the first part on the commodity. You start with a chapter on the transformation of money into capital.
Well, what about commodity fetishism? What
He
about
doesn't.
reification?
He doesn't think these things are that important at this point. It's not really part of the structure. The capital itself has reached these levels of abstraction and no longer, yeah.
Didn't he at one point acknowledge that he never read much of Marx?
Well, that was the rumor. I don't know. It's kind of hard to believe he didn't read a lot of Marx, given what he did. But yeah, I mean, the claim was that Althusser would read his student papers and he would, gather his thinking around these papers rather than reading the original text. That was one claim about this. However, there's a man named Cornu, Auguste Cornu. This is the man who made, French Marxism present to the philosophical community, and this is the person that Althusser basically was, educated by, in terms of the Marx moment. And Althusser was also Catholic in background. Althusser's first publications were in the French journal Esprit, and there was, which is a Catholic journal. I mean, at a high level. I mean, it's not catechism and this kind of dogmatism, but he did have these conversations and maintained a long-term friendship with I forgot the man's name, but he was a Catholic philosopher, and they would talk about belief and God, etc. But at the same time, Althusser's office was filled with the likes of Tran Vác Tô, the great Vietnamese philosopher who wrote a book called Dialectical Materialism and Phenomenology, in which he has a long critique of Husserlian phenomenology in the language of dialectical materialism, who was Secretary of Agriculture for a while and then was completely disassociated and basically, I think, totally exiled once he went back to Vietnam, in a very tragic situation. But anyway, Tran Vác Tô, major work. Jacques Derrida said this was the most influential book on him as a young man, Phenomenology and Dialectical Materialism. Tran Vác Tô, yeah. Althusser wrote this in a little piece called The Time of the Thesis, when he's beginning this moment. So this is filled with many, I mean, there are layers of stories here. There are many narratives in between. But yes, I mean, maybe he didn't read, every line of Marx, in a sense. But I don't think this takes away from the originality of the thinking here, because this is a very different approach, I think, to the reading of Marx. And again, this is Lenin reading Marx, just as much as just reading Marx, right? I mean, this is an interesting thing. And Derrida always pointed out, and I think this is interesting too, that, if you're going to really be a materialist, you have to talk about the materiality of texts and intertextuality. So when you use the proper name Marx, right? Through what prisms, through which intertexts are we really seeing here, right? In some ways. So in the Althusserian case, you have to have always this relationship of Marx and Lenin, right? Operative. You can see this working out, and as I mentioned to you, Althusser, through Jean Hippolyte, shook up the French community of philosophers by privileging Lenin as a philosopher. Now, I don't think Lenin's especially a great philosopher, but he's a great practical philosopher, so this is another story, but anyway, Althusser is bringing this into the fore. I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. I don't know, is this most people's first exposure to Althusser, or is it just yeah, okay, all right.
For me, yes.
Okay, yeah, okay. I mean, he was household, during the In England during the 70s, there's a whole Althusserian group that aren't, really great Althusserians, but Ben Brewster was one of the translators, Chris Arthur. There's a whole group of people that came out of this, right? And Perry Anderson at New Left Review was also very influenced by Althusser. Yeah. And this was one of the ways that they tried to take over the journal. He, Tariq Ali, Robin Blackburn, and others, but primarily Anderson. They took it over from E.P. Thompson, which is humanistic Marxism. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and Althusser and Thompson got into it too. The reply to John Lewis, in which Althusser really run after Thompson, and then Thompson wrote a piece called The Poverty of Theory. Which was kind of famous in a
Very
book
famous,
called
yeah.
Writing by Candlelight. So there's been this this British, the channel, the English channel, what's going on in the Anglo-Franco, exchange constantly, But, yeah. And the French, of course, they have a very different philosophical tradition behind them. We're talking about Descartes, right? We're talking about a major, breakthrough, and as Althusser says, incontinence in the production of new concepts. I mean, the relationship of Descartes and Galileo is very, very important to modern science and to the production of, ideology, and the distinctions and tensions he's trying to show between science and ideology, right? And, but really Althusser wants no attempt to go back to bourgeois, ideology. And this is what he's fighting against. And he sees terms, to go back to Beth's question, alienation, reification, still trapped within bourgeois humanism in some ways. Yeah. Oh, that's horrible, you're reified. Oh, that's horrible, you're alienated. For Althusser, these are terms which are symptomatic of the system, that we have to look at what is the dominant structure at a certain moment. So he would be, probably the discourse with Althusser today would be, let's study derivatives in terms of its structural dominance. We're not going to study alienation or the anomie that the derivatives create, but what it does for the system, what it is doing within the system, within finance capital. Yeah, this is kind of thing. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So
yeah.
his objection to humanist Marxism was not so much that it's wrong to speak of alienation or reification, but rather it's simply irrelevant in terms of...
Irrelevant, and the language is still smacking of bourgeois philosophy. That alienation is used as early as Grotius, then it's recast by Rousseau, and recast then by Hegel, right? And so the term itself, Entfremdung, right? And then Lassen, right? Yeah, these terms are still within a bourgeois philosophical horizon, right? And they become, at least to him, kind of a regress, right? Not in the phenomenological sense, but a regression back into the past, and yield a kind of humanistic approach instead of a real structural approach. Yeah, to things. Yeah, I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
So this is what he's trying to do. The same thing with reification. Yeah. His notion of objectification is, how do you create objects of investigation that are new? What has been opened up by these new concepts? So he's really attempting to always get neologisms and produce new concepts. And I can go to the passages here that might, elucidate this well. I mean, one of the reasons I chose this, I think this is fundamental to understanding a lot of his thinking vis-a-vis both Marx and the Reading Capital Group. I think this is a kind of seminal essay. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong book. 2 black books. Anyway, the historical task here opens up a lot of things. So we can go through it pretty carefully, because I think, again, this is someone, and Ben Brewster, Chris Arthur, this whole group of English Marxists, then translated into the United States. And Althusser was not really popular in the States until the diacritical moment of Derrida. People started to go back to Althusser at that point. Althusser never really made it into literary theory too much. It was Deman, Harold Bloom, the deconstruction. The same thing in the world of painting, even though Carl Andre of the Soho crowd, who also, allegedly killed his wife, was an Althusserian. Yeah, Now, I don't know if you know Carl Andre, but he was a sculptor. I think he died recently, right?
I don't know. Yeah, he seems pretty dead.
No, but I meant literally.
Yeah,
biologically.
I think.
Yeah, no, I know he's been dead for a long time.
Pretty dead.
Yeah.
It seemed to
Yeah,
me
go
that,
ahead, I'm listening, yeah.
my impression was that he wants, especially through reading this text, is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
he wants to get rid of the humanism, kind of because of this notion of the ISA, in a sense, like the day after the revolution, you have to have the theory ready,
Yes,
or
I
you'll
mean,
have the counter-revolution.
Ideology, and the ISA refers to, some people haven't read him, ISA is the ideological state apparatuses. And he juxtaposed this to the repressive, the RSAs were the repressive state apparatuses. And the repressive state apparatuses are obviously the police, right? The state and its functions, the judiciary system, the justice system, all of these things that are operative. My feeling is this is all we have today anyway. In the surveillance state, forget the ideology, that's already been won, that battle,
Right.
by capitalist triumphalism in some ways. But for Althusser, the ISA was very important because even after the revolution,
Right.
let's say, in Russia, 1917, he's learning from history, right? That you still have the remnants of ideology, right? So this is why he's so careful with this, because he understands we're going to get a Zhanaev reaction. We may get a Trotskyist reaction, et cetera, along the way. And he's trying to guard against that. So the ideological state apparatuses, the number one thing is the family, right? This is the major ideological state apparatus. How does the family function? How does it inculcate? How does it determine value systems? The formation, obviously, of the superego early on, etc. And the family makes you sick. The new family, Freud, will make you well. Is the kind of the battle cry of psychoanalysis, right? In this sense. So the family is one of these. Then the church, right? Right. Given that France is a Catholic country, etc. Here, not as much in the active way, but our church has always been anti-communism and now Islamophobia and now Russia-phobia too. I mean, we always have to have the other, in order to position the unilateralism, etc. So the church too. So the father isn't enough. We need the big father, right, etc. And then finally, where it really goes on, and this is something that most people really liked that were professors, obviously, was the educational state apparatus. How does capital reproduce itself? What about social reproduction? And out of this comes people such as Pierre Bourdieu, Stanley and Giroux, Aronowitz and Giroux, and education under siege, some of this stuff against schooling, is all part of the ideological state apparatus that Louis Althusser kind of opened up. As most of you maybe know, Bowles and Gintis, capitalist schooling in America. Do you know that? The school of Sam Gintis, Herbert Bowles? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
UMass, I think.
UMass Amherst, yeah. And so the educational apparatus, and now people, I like to include it here, but I have a ongoing, friendly argument with a friend of mine, Dennis Bro, about should the media be a new separate thing? How do we deal with Twitter, social media, and all of this? But this is now our new ideological state apparatus, right? You have new constellations through Twitter, Instagram. I don't even know what else is out. All these new things.
Don't worry about it.
Invented each day in terms of IPOs. We can't feed people,
that's all
but
you need
we
to
can
know.
certainly have capital for IPOs about re-edit or redo it or let's do it or whatever. Right. So anyway, so this is Althusser. This is what's taken up by most people. And, to give you a little bit of history, Screen Magazine, which was a major cinema magazine, really became the Althusserian organ in cinema studies. Screen Magazine, which was an English publication. Cahiers du Cinema was not, but they did take up some of the work there. But the organ really became Screen Magazine, which is worth reading, going back to read. Yeah.
Did they put any of those? You have to buy each one, or how do you read them?
I don't know if they're online now, I don't know. I heard
there
a great
books?
story about, just as an aside, about Jonas Mekas, a friend of mine. I talked to someone today who went to, we were talking about Jonas Mekas passing away a few
Yeah.
weeks ago
Oh,
at 96, and what a great man he was, and all of this, and et cetera. And that people like that don't exist, and relationships don't exist, where someone will give you the Armory building at $1 a year rent
Yeah, the
to keep
anthology,
anthology film archives.
Yeah.
So he went to Jonas Mekas' apartment, and they were hanging out, etc. And Mekas had all these cahiers de cinema. Take them. I have too many. It's all over his place of original things of cahiers de cinema. So I'm sure you read Screen as well. And I have some of the film comments that they put out from Anthology, which was great early on. I have a great interview with Roberto Rossellini that they did. So, yeah, anyway, so this became one of the great outlets, and this became a very advanced way of looking at cinema. Very advanced way, where the mirror stage and ideology was being read into cinema. Yeah, in a way. And so, just to give you an idea of the influence here, yes, the media was already incorporated in his educational thing, but like I said, I'm open to the discussion.
Good one, yeah.
In some ways, is media new separate from education? It seems like the media is what's educating.
Yeah.
So it's not really that separate. What's really happening is the destruction of the institutions of higher learning, especially the humanities, right? Which has all been part of a capitalist moment for many, many years, but this is accelerated with student loans, as most of you know, during the Reagan years, that there was a plot. There was really literally a plot. Listen,
Can't believe that.
we cannot, guarantee affirmative action. Really to play upon the wire once again. The most dangerous person in America is a Negro with a library card. We don't really want library cards for these people. Let them stay in the housing projects or go the way of Jay-Z and hustle and flow or whatever. Heaven forbid that they become educated. And if they do, make sure they're like Cory Booker or, I know I'm going to get in trouble, but
Go ahead.
it's okay. I'll slow down.
No.
Yeah. How dare I? Yeah. Anyway, anyway, this became, obviously an assault, a literal assault. The administrative class has taken over education, both in terms of not only the management of everyday life, capital expenditures, or everyday practices in the educational sphere, but as much, in terms of curriculum. Yeah, it's very, very hard to get new programs developed, much less even to run, interesting electives at this point. It's impossible for anybody, unless you're completely world famous, to do a course like a Foucault, where you choose a topic that is in the present, that faces the present, that is a philosophy of the present, and build something for 14 weeks around that theme, and do it as a lecture, of which the book is being done while it's happening. Very, very difficult.
I was just
Yeah,
reading
please,
a piece
yeah.
that
Yeah.
Hampshire College is about to go under.
Yeah, well, that was the
Liberal.
5 colleges.
No, yeah, that's the small liberal arts where you
Yeah.
design, students design
Yeah.
their own
Yeah, I know
curriculum.
Hampshire.
They don't have to,
Yeah.
there's no set curriculum.
That's right.
Yeah, so,
Not
Right.
anymore.
and turned out, for its size, it turned out a lot of, very educated,
Well, yeah, they had educated people educating those
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
That was the thing,
Right.
too. That's another thing. It raises the question, what does it mean to be educated? It really raises that. What is education versus schooling? What does it mean to be educated? Does education really mean that you can, really understand the underpinnings of the social reproduction function of the schools and how you become a part of that? How do you become interpolated into the system? Hey, you over there, you belong in class. Be cool and stay in school. Is an example of, if you will, of the interpolation of Althusser, which is a rhetorical strategy. Which a better, rhetorical strategy is, they're breeding Bolsheviks in the bathroom. Or something like, that's a better one, or do you really believe that? That's really that's a good starting point.
That's a great poster.
Yeah.
We had it during
Yeah.
the union drive. We had it in the bathrooms.
Is your bathroom breeding
Is your
Bolsheviks?
bathroom, the guy is disgusted with.
Right.
Hot towels, actually.
Right,
that
right,
was-
right, right.
That was,
Yeah.
Right.
that was a straight up.
Yeah, I
Right,
remember.
yeah. He was disgusted with the quality of the bathroom
Right.
tissue.
It was,
Oh, yeah, Scott.
Yeah. All right,
Scott,
listen,
you a Bolshevik.
I remember days when we used to go to these bars, and there were people that would walk in before a group would come in that were militant, and they'd check out the bathrooms, all the scenes, the kitchen, to make sure the place wasn't bugged or wasn't, You don't see any of that anymore. What's on the menu is everybody. Everybody's hungry. What's the food? Yeah, nobody
all
checks
bugged.
it out. Yeah,
Bugged everywhere.
yeah. No. So anyway,
And now
I
your
mean,
cell phone bug you.
Exactly.
this is very, very important to, the last, I'd say at least 25, 30 years, very dominant in thinking about ideology. Apparatuses. And apparatus in French, and I'm using this in English, is really the Gestalt, the framework, how we're framed up, right, in the Heideggerian sense. This goes back to Heidegger's great essay on the essence of technology, which I recommend reading. It's a beautiful essay. Fascist or not, National Socialist or not, I don't think it was fascist, he was a National Socialist, yes, but, but anyway, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just a question that
Yeah.
came up for me was I was reading Althusser. This is my
Yeah,
first
sure.
introduction. to
Okay,
Althusser.
yeah.
The ISA thing seemed to me a lot like my very primitive understanding of what Gramsci meant by hegemony. Right? It's
Yes.
just sort of like a domestic version of soft power, sort of, right?
Yes,
So it doesn't
yes.
seem that new to me. It seems like
It's
hegemony.
you're always good at pointing out these fundamental.
I didn't mean to be
No, it's
critical.
okay. It's okay. Economic
true.
and philosophical manuscripts of the time, and I hear you now with Gramsci and Althusser. Althusser borrows heavily from Gramsci, heavily, and I think you're right in taking a term like hegemony and seeing it operative, as well as the organic intellectual, because Althusser is trying to build the new intellectual, and he's actually going back to what we did with Gramsci. What is the study of philosophy for?
Yeah.
And Althusser even has concepts like spontaneous philosophy and the spirit of science. So it's a very
So there's-
good point. There is a
Okay.
very you're reading. You're reading extremely well in terms of the correlation between this thinker in prison from 1928 till 1935, that 7-year run of 32 notebooks, 3,000 pages that we have, and Althusser, who discovers him early and uses him tremendously. Okay, so
But at some point
and then
he's-
there's a return to Gramsci in a direct way in the book on Machiavelli and us, because Gramsci wrote The Modern Prince, which was a rewrite of The Prince for our times. Machiavelli and us was Althusser's attempt to look at The Prince as a manifesto of the people, a dual reading that he actually picks up from Gramsci. Yes, Beth, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just remember early on in the essay, he kind of refers to Gramsci. The only reference, I guess one of the only references I saw, maybe I missed them,
Yeah.
kind of derisively as a historicist.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
well, he is the right, this has always been a problem with Gramsci, the temporality of historicism. Yeah, instead of history, capitalized.
Could you explain that?
Well, historicist means you're only in that, quote, imminent moment of the time. You're only facing, quote, the present, etc. You're not really in an imminent and transcendent relationship and trying to build much more futurally. So the historicist is always dealing with the strategy and the tactic of the moment, and not especially the future, and building a kind of new conceptual ground. This is what Althusser is going to critique in, say, the historicist tradition.
And he's all about the conjuncture. Is that partly?
Yeah, the conjuncture.
What-
The conjuncture is always that kind of
anti-historicist?
meeting point. Yes, the meeting point of where we are. Yeah. The meeting point, which is it's not only just the present or the situation, it's the conjuncture of forces. Try to think of this both ideas, forces, balance of forces, etc. What's in disequilibrium? Where's the structure and dominance? He's doing all these kind of things. Maybe for next time I can figure out a good diagram to kind of map this out for you. I'm starting to try to think it through in terms of, you know, the map, if you will, a kind of cognitive mapping, if you will, of Althusser's notions here. So anyway, yes, this is what he's going for, a new continent. This is really what it is. You know, he speaks of the continents, and maybe that's a good starting point too, in terms of his educational background, or what he's going to give to education. The Greeks open up the continent of mathematics. It's thesis, right? This is the continent. Philosophy has a lag time. Philosophy is Nachtraligkeit. It serves, you know, a delayed response to the great discovery.
The Owl of Minerva.
The Owl of Minerva is one very good example of this. Yeah, and yeah. So, but speaking of the Owl of Minerva, what Althusser would like, you know, to play on that a little bit, is Zarathustra overcoming that moment of recollection, right? Moving into the future and overcoming the concepts of the past, right? Or the recapitulation.
Yeah.
So Althusser is going to be a sort of against, if you will, you know, in that sense, the Hegelian Owl of Minerva. The Owl of Minerva is a term used by Hegel that, you know, at the end of the day, everything is recapitulated, right? And it takes flight at dusk, right? Right? And anyway, so for Althusser, you have Thales, opens up the continent of mathematics, of which Plato responds. And this is where Badiou goes the way of the mathematical ontology, right? In a sense, and as I was doing last week, you had the philosophy of the one and the many as being part of the epoch. For Althusser, these are continents, right? He's more materialistic than Heidegger, and just epochal time, right? He's looking into temporality of, you know, the earth, if you will, through these metaphors of continents and lands and terrain and all of this. So the second one, of course, is Galilean physics, of whom the philosopher then becomes René Descartes, Le Monde, right? Yeah. You know, and the Cartesian moment and the Cartesian method, deductive systems. Instead of him saying an inductive systems of Bacon and experimental philosophy and experimental science, which is very dominant in England going forward. And Bacon is interesting in the sense that he's more materialist, at least in my mind, than Descartes. I would argue with Althusser here that Bacon is in touch with all the craftspeople. He's in touch with the electricians. He's in touch with a lot of the guild masters. He's in touch with, you know, craftspeople during this period, people that are doing work on statics, you know, etc. Not the high sciences of that point. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, you know. Bacon is more connected to the Masons, to the underground. And you know, Hegel gave lectures after hours to Masons. You know, a very interesting story. Yeah, Hegel did, yes. After hours would go to the Masons, right? So, I mean, you know, philosophy has this kind of secret history. You know, it's kind of interesting, you know, that's not really talked about too much. So, and then, of course, the third continent. So you have the continent of mathematics, right? The continent of physics, and then the continent of history. So this is where he's going to go against the historicist, you know, notion of Gramsci that, you know, history is a continent. That historical materialism has to kind of always be rethought. So part of the argument there is with Gramsci, right? You know, how do we build a dialectical materialism, the philosophy of Marx, right? You know, that's never really explicated, never really developed, right, alongside of this new continent called history.
Right.
Okay, you want to say, yeah, please.
It's not, it's not absolutizing history, right?
It's
like,
not what?
It's kind of the absolute history, like.
No, this is no absolute
That's
history.
his problem.
No, history is a process without a subject.
Right.
I want you to remember, this is a famous phrase of here, is history is a process, and process in French is trial. You know, you go on trial, process, in German too, the process, the Kafka, right? History is a process without a subject. Right? And this was the crucial term here. So subjectivity was not the strong point of the Althusserians, right? Individuality, trans-individuality, anything. Everything was displaced, if you will, right? And rethought in terms of historical materialism and what that would look like. So this is hard-boiled. You know, it's not like, you know, you talk about your pain, what kind of bourgeois, you know, ideology is that? You talk about your, you know, your losses, your fail, what kind of bourgeois ideology is that? You gotta go visit your grandmother in the hospital. You know, these kind of things, this kind of sentimental education completely thrown out the window. You know, the advent of modernity is probably Madame Bovary and sentimental education of Flaubert, at least in the novel form. Cornelius isn't here, but we, you know, if he was, he could, you know, maybe say he sees other novels. But I see sentimental education as being sort of the advent of the modernist fiction, yeah, in a lot of ways, and Madame Bovary. But anyway, so I don't know. I mean, this is it's extremely complicated. If you think about that, what he's really trying to do here is build a philosophy of history, which is again a bourgeois humanist term. He would never call it that. Just by me saying that, the Althusserians would scream at me. What philosophy of history? No such thing. That's bourgeois. That's Hegel. That's that. You know, etc. Right. So what we're really doing is historical materialism. Yeah, it's a new science that's being created here. No such thing. So when Sartre says there are no philosophies, there are only ideologies, Althusser is following up on this. Yes, we do not have we're in the baby steps, right, of a materialist Marxist philosophy. But what came before is all bourgeois, right? And we're gonna have to use that language, inhabit it at a certain point. However, we have to always overcome that language. And he has many categories about this. So he has Marx in Reading Capital, reading, for example, Adam Smith. Labor is the source of all value. He wants to rewrite this. Marx shifts completely that proposition, instead of expanding upon it, shifts it completely to surplus value. Value becomes something very different. And so labor as a source of value, right, is a humanist position. One of the reasons he may want to go beyond a Lukács in terms of reification, or the laborer, you know, in this moment of objectivity, you know, objectification, etc. Not that he's totally again. I mean, he sees this. I mean, you know, this is not a blind person. You know, it's just theorizing. You know.
But I just don't
Yeah,
understand
okay, yeah,
how you
sure.
could, I mean, to me, surplus value was grounded in a labor theory of value. I don't see how it is a change from labor theory of value, right? And surplus value is simply the labor value extracted from the workers, right? It's still based on a labor theory of value.
Well, I mean, surplus value is really not really profit, right?
Right.
Yeah, surplus value is, you're right, the extraction of value from the human being, but surplus value could also mean, to an Althusserian, stuff of the extraction of natural resources, you know, how things become valued in a very different way. So, you know, you begin to see this too. The value isn't always associated just by the labor that's put into it, right, as a source, right?
I mean, I think
So
that's certainly an
different
argument that can
extraction
be
of
made, but I don't think
surplus.
that's what Marx, I mean, in Capital, Marx does, you know, through, God, I'm forgetting my volume 3 now, but he has an account of, you know, how,
Right.
you know, resource extraction is.
Yeah,
built into
land,
capital
labor, and
capital,
capital, yes, right, the trinity, yeah. No, he does
I
speak
mean,
of
it just
that.
seems to me that he is very much in the labor theory of value. I don't see how surplus value is a change from that.
Well, but what he's saying is, though, that Marx comes up with different categories and concepts to talk about labor as being the source of value. So surplus value becomes a complete shift in how we look at value. That's what he's really trying to say here. That Marx begins this new conceptual vocabulary that gives us a greater understanding, right? You know, that a Smith could not see, that a Ricardo could not see, just in land and rent, right? Ricardo couldn't see land, labor, and capital. You know, he couldn't see the triad in terms of a dialectical relationship. So this is what an Althusser is saying in terms of how Marx reads. You know, remember also there's something going on here, not only the militant practice of how you translate reading into political practice and into a militancy, but also an exercise in reading. How is Marx reading these people, again, to go back to this whole thing of the intertextuality, etc., right? So, you know, now you get people that are reading, like this guy from McGill, Roberts, Dante's Inferno, and Marx. You know, he's trying to make these kind of allegories of reading, right? In a sense, to an Althusserian, this is complete nonsense. You know, why waste the time? You know, why do you turn it into a theoretical, you know, why do you turn theory into some kind of allegory of reading? You know, for them. This is really what they're against. I'm not saying this is right. Please don't hear me that way. I mean, I like allegory too. You know, the great thing about the word allegory, it comes from the Greek allos ineto agora. It's the other story that's being whispered in the marketplace. So it's a kind of interesting, you know, if you really think about allegory that way instead of just imparting the lesson, it's giving you the real lesson in a sense. But anyway. Yeah, I mean, look, you make some very good points here. Does Althusser really, of course, you know, what is he trying to do here? He's trying to take a very underdeveloped dialectical materialism and begin to develop it with principles. And we'll talk, that's the intention. He's trying to engage it that way. The very underdeveloped, uneven development of philosophy with quote unquote categories in political economy. And he's trying to read Marx as a philosopher, not and using philosophical, you know, terminology to do this. And this is why he wants to make the claim, and he's trying to do this with the claim, that this is science. You know, that Marx has an epistemological break that begins with a German ideology. And you know, Rick Wolff is part of that group back with Resnick for speaking of Amherst. Knowledge in Class is an attempt towards a Marxist epistemology. You know, in a way, the book that they wrote in the 80s. You know, Rick actually lost his golden boy status with the monthly review crowd by going to work with Althusser and meeting Althusser in Paris during the 70s. And they wouldn't talk to him anymore, the monthly review. The humanist crowd wouldn't talk to the anti-humanist crowd. So it's kind of an interesting story.
Is
And
that
then
because they're
Rick-
so based in economistic?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is always, and you saw the terms. I mean, we can read him because he levels. I mean, you know, he's name calling both by theory and stuff. I mean, you know, this is someone that's not frightened of his quote colleagues or backlash or anything. I mean, this is a person that went through an enormous amount of psychiatric care. He's a manic depressive. He had many hospitalizations, you know, many outbursts, you know, in his career at the same time. Yeah, well, she was giving him a massage. It was the nightly massage, and he lost control. Yeah, I understand. It probably wasn't premeditated, although the hand didn't know what the mind was doing. Yeah, anyway, I'm being very nice here. I never met, you know, but I heard she was not the, you know, end all to be all to, you know.
Well, there you go.
Oh,
That's
wow.
fine. There you go, right?
It happens every day. I mean, to be like Althusser and this kind of hard-boiled, you know, bourgeois thinking about, yeah. Anyway, but of course, look, you know how the bourgeois use this. Just like what David mentioned, you know, he just got his Marx, you know, never really read Marx. And all these rumors start about him, don't read him, you know, he's dangerous, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's like Heidegger with a Nazi. I mean,
You what?
That happened to me as an undergraduate. I mean, until reading Althusser in the past couple of weeks, my knowledge of him was, oh, he's that guy who killed his wife. That crazy
Really?
guy.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. I mean, that's why I made the comment. I don't mean to be, yeah. Right, yeah. Aline, she was the militant of the household too. Supposedly she was, you know, this is what I thought, you know.
Was he convicted of killing her?
No, the French are good at these
I was
things, man.
protected.
The French are very good. This is a famous philosopher. There's a very good hospital down the block.
So good, yeah.
There's a very good hospital down the block where he's been many times. Call the doctor. You know, he ain't had medicine in more than a week, so you know, put him up.
justice.
Yeah, the bourgeois forgiveness,
Not
right?
guilty by reason
Bou-
of philosophy.
yeah, by reason of philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although he says we're guilty as philosophers at the beginning of reading
Well,
Calvin.
maybe he should have
Yeah.
been guilty.
Anyway, yeah, he lived in, and you know, Derrida would go visit him in the hospital every day, bring flowers, which was very nice when he was in Paris. You know, Balibar would talk about how the desk was just filled with papers, and we got to get to work. We have so much work to do, and he'd show the manuscript. So a lot of the stuff we're getting today is stuff that he was working on, you know, after this event in 80, I think the early 80s, yeah, before Foucault died, you know, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I heard story David Tracy, who's a Catholic, philosopher at University of Chicago, and a classicist, started crying in class when he read the news. That's how much Althusser was revered by a lot of people that had read him and knew him, you know. So anyway, I don't want to justify, you know, the murder here, but you know, in a way, yeah, he was kept alive and he kept thinking, and it went on for 10, 12 years. And the homages at the funeral, Derrida's, I'll get you a copy. I think I gave to one class, right? I'll give you a copy
Yeah.
of the eulogy that Derrida wrote. Very beautiful. I'll get a copy again, and I'll bring them in. Yeah. Please. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Storytelling.
So, vulgar Marxism or economism, how is this different?
Same question.
Yeah.
How is it different?
Because he calls it structure?
Well, I mean, that's one term he's using. He's also using a term of overdetermination and contradiction, and that every structure is overdetermined. So to reduce it just to economism, right, is a misnomer. It's wrong-headed. You know, you're not looking at all the elements that build that structure and then make it a dominance in the structure. And unless you do that, you have no chance of really being strategically involved at the theoretical level of making right decisions or moving forward in terms of revolutionary practice. This is what he's really saying. So he's saying always, look, the slogan here is without revolutionary theory, you know, there would be a workers' movement, but there would not be a workers' revolution. You know, if the workers have a movement, yes, they have the unions, they have economistic unions, tell me about my wages, that's all I give a shit about, you know, et cetera. Yeah, but, you know, without the theory, there's no such. So really, in a way, this is a kind of privileging, if you will, and a reinforcement of the Leninist vanguard.
Yeah, he's
Right.
a Leninist.
It's a Leninist movement. Yeah, please, Chris. Yeah.
He really wants to make Marxism a science, he says it over
Yes.
and over again.
Yeah.
And I respect that very much, I respect his work, but it's also, I think, the question that has to be begged, is that the whole story? That
What story?
Is Marxism just a science, or a science, or should it be? a science?
Well, you have to define science, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And science is pretty open-ended. I have a definition from his text. It says producing new knowledge and new theoretical
Right, what
concepts.
page? That's
164.
4, yeah, that's early on.
That's
yeah.
a very broad notion
Yeah,
of
yeah.
science. It's not
Yeah.
everybody
scientism.
would agree with that,
Right.
but he goes much further.
By the end of the
Yeah.
text, it's something about objectivity, ultimately.
Yes.
And as you said earlier, he leaves out subjects, so, well, we know
There's
that
no subject or subjectivity in the Althusserian corpus that I know of. Yeah. Except his own subjectivity, which was, you know, obviously,
Interpolation.
a psychiatric case.
But he does pay some homage to Lacan, at least by name, which of course he read.
Yes,
here.
no,
I think
absolutely,
he goes very
but I
far.
mean, with a
Yeah.
homage to Lacan, Althusser stayed within the dominant French psychiatric practice. So in a way, there was a major contradiction in his own life that on one hand, he sees the relevance and the advance of Lacanian psychoanalysis on a very banal Freudianism in France, and also, you know, a kind of psychiatric system of which I think being that nothingness is directed at the French psychoanalytics, At one level, it's an attempt, an existential psychoanalysis grows out of that, of Sartre. And, you know, and he goes the way of you know, medication, you know, psychotropic drugs, as well as, you know, staying in touch with a psychiatrist, not a Lacanian analyst, some of whom became analysts who were students of his. Monique Menard, David Menard was a student of his. Many known Lacanians were students of his, you know, that came up. Chantal Mouffe was a student of his. By the way, she's not a psychoanalyst. She's nuts, but she's smart nuts in some ways. You know, she's out there today. But anyway, yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, maybe we can read just a little bit about it. I mean, again, this is the historical text. As you read probably in the beginning, this was an attempt by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, a philosopher who basically collaborated with Stalin and then became still the chief philosopher during the Brezhnev era, commissioned this piece. And Althusser went through many trials with this, etc. Never was really published in the Soviet Union. He made sure it was too long. You know, he had discussions with his mistress, with Franca, and with Balibar, you know. And by the way, the Machiavelli book, just to speak about Franca, he was visiting with Franca. That's when he fell in love with his Italian woman friend. And he wrote the Machiavelli text about that. So he did have some human qualities, Althusser, you know, despite all that process without a subject. All right. So anyway, you know, and then the new journal, you know, that they were also what was going on at this time. And those of you familiar with Jean-Luc Godard, you know, this is the period that La Chinoise is made. You know, the film La Chinoise, which anticipates all the events of May of '68. Yeah, very interesting enough. And there are all calisthenics on a balcony of where they're doing calisthenics on the theoretical base, which is a homage to Althusser in the Godard film, La Chinoise. Yeah. And then weekend after that, yeah.
It seems to me, though, that in that situation in particular, it was Goran who was really the Althusserian, and that Godard was kind of the existentialist.
Later, yes.
And that there's kind of the conflation.
Well, they didn't make La Chinoise and Weekend together. The collaboration with Goran started later. Yeah, it started in the late '60s, but not in the middle.
He looked to Goran for the essentially the philosophy behind La Chinoise.
He was the Maoist, and that's true. Yeah, no question.
But I think it's an interesting moment, actually, this sort of conflation of the idea of subject or without a subject.
Well, yeah, the without a subject also is a kind of bow, if you will, because Althusser also wrote on contradiction on Mao's great text on contradiction. So there was this huge Maoist, you know, moment in French Marxism, and especially around the Althusserians, right? And you know, the French fascination with Maoism. Julia Kristeva went to China and then wrote a book called About Chinese Women. Soles, all these people were very much, you know, taken by this, yeah.
Why?
And Tel was a Maoist group too.
Why were they so taken with Maoism in France, in particular? It was an
hard, and there's process without a subject.
Was it like an anti-party kind of position?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yeah. The party was still Stalinist.
So they were trying to find something else.
It was Georges Marchais, Roger Garadet, Valdac Rocher. All of these people were very much influenced in the effect of Stalinists.
Right.
So, listen, the way to, I mean, in some ways, you situate this text at multiple levels.
Right.
One level, of course, is his dialogue with the French Communist Party. Yep. That he's still trying to be, quote, the philosopher, like Della Volpe with the Italians, as I mentioned last week. That there is this ongoing, you know, attempted dialogue with the party. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now remember, in '68, Althusser is the leading philosopher in France, right? I mean, by that point, I mean, what I mean by leading, he's got the students, you know, all these people are all students of his, you know, that are leading the stuff out there. So Althusser's in the position with the party where, you know, he's the go-to person in the schools, in a sense. And Althusser would not commit. You know, they didn't go on the streets, the Althusserians. Badiou went, but Althusser and Balibar did not. They stayed, in the offices, right? In some ways. So this is interesting because he would see, in a sense, that failure as, it was not the right time. The strategy wasn't there.
Yeah.
There was a lag time between, philosophy and the moment, right? All of these kind of things. So in a way, it's a kind of system that is somewhat foolproof in terms of failures. The philosophy hasn't gone up yet,
Right.
In some way. I mean, in some ways. I'm not saying this is the whole story,
Sure.
but yeah, please, yeah. Yeah.
Or was he saying that philosophy had to develop first before the?
No,
No, wait a minute.
philosophy
Continent.
always was catching up with the scientific.
Right.
Yeah, he doesn't really phrase it like we do in American philosophy departments. Philosophy is the handmaiden to the sciences.
Yeah.
He's actually really talking about philosophy has the conceptual tools, but they have to be developed in order to catch up,
okay.
and then it will go ahead of the scientific discoveries.
Yeah.
So Plato ultimately becomes an advance on Thales' mathematics in terms of the debates and what we have. Descartes becomes an advance on Galileo. Marx's notion of history is something we're still trying to catch up with, but with philosophical ideas, right? In a sense. So alienation may belong, and objectification and reification may belong to a bygone era of a humanistic Marx. Now remember, again, and this goes back to what you were saying, Althusser is going to divide Marx. In 1845, the German ideology is the break, the epistemological break, with the humanistic Feuerbachian Marx. And he has all kinds of sections in here. This is a dense piece, I mean, to put it mildly, at least to the philosophical mind. He'll talk about the inversion, right? But the inversion is really done, that most Marxists are Feuerbachians, they're not Marxists, because they're only inverting
Right.
spirit for matter, turning, Hegel back on his, feet, right? Yeah, so this is a Feuerbachian move to Althusser, not the real move. So this is the work of a humanistic Feuerbachian move. What were we going to say?
I mean,
Yeah.
of course accusing Lenin of that.
Mm.
Yeah, well,
course.
they're all accusing each other. The part of the problem is the problem of the history of Marxism in the 20th century, and especially among Marxist theoreticians, is one accusation after another, right? And it's been a real problem over many years, and one of the reasons is it doesn't get anywhere sometimes, because it becomes macho, high-level sports, wrestling matches, instead of, really getting down to what the F is going on, and let's really analyze the situation and be able to bring some practice to it.
Is that why we don't have it anymore? Did
I
they kill
think
each other
I
off?
think so many people have been so frustrated with all the pointing of fingers and the accusations and all the schisms and the bad blood. This is something that Guattari, spoke to Negri about. I think that Negri tries to break out of that they're kind of separate, out there, the autonomia. Groups in Italy, and in a way, what I mentioned last week, the Italians really did some interesting work during the 70s, some special new work in terms of household labor, Da Costa, Federici's kind of the outgrowth of that, Caliban and the Witch, and her work is a part of that Negri influence stuff, Tronti, very different approaches, right?
Yeah.
Without the humanism, too, in some ways. So, personally, I think this is what really turns off a lot of people. Ernesto Laclau said this, and David Harvey said this, and
What were you
so-and-so
gonna
said
say?
this.
Well, but I also think,
Yeah.
that people get frustrated with actual historical events that take place
Right.
and are misinterpreted and completely, for instance, we have he was in dialogue with the French Communist Party and was pissed off at them, I think.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you've got a situation now where there's stuff in Venezuela, for instance.
Right.
The Workers' World Party took over Venezuela Solidarity and has occupied it for over a decade.
Right.
And they are completely incapable of mobilizing any kind of resistance against it. And I get furious when I think of that, you know?
Right.
I mean, I just like, you fucking idiots, you fucking play at being revolutionaries.
Have you ever heard of Fidel Castro?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no,
I didn't know Workers' World had taken over Venezuela Solidarity.
Yeah, well,
What are the front groups that they're?
The
Is it
Alliance for
Global
Justice.
Justice Alliance?
The Alliance for Global Justice
I
is the
was
Workers'
going
World.
through that
It-
website the other day trying to figure out who was behind them.
Well, PSL is behind them now because they're the split off of Workers' World.
Oh.
So it's the
Jody
Party of
Dean's
Socialism
party.
and Liberation, you know? So they're just a Trotskyist idiots, you know?
So
but
what's your point?
my point is that people do get pissed off at this stuff because, you know, there are real stakes.
Well, yeah, let me
You
just
mean the
mention.
sectarianism?
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
the sectarianism. Let me just mention this. Althusser is well aware of the history of 1917 up to 1953,
Yeah.
right? He's very well aware of this. He's very well aware of the tradition of Lenin, Lukács, Korsch, you know, somewhat the Frankfurt School. I don't know how much he read of them. He certainly read some Lukács and stuff like that. They're aware. They're in Europe. These people talk to each other. As you know, Paris is a
Yeah.
place where, you know, you learn more in a cafe than you do in 10 years in school in the United States, right? I mean, in some ways, at least during that period, you could. And so to keep in mind that, you know, in a way, he's writing at the end of the beginning of the de-Stalinization, right? It's 14 years later, but the party is still holding on to a kind of almost like socialism in one country, or let's do social democracy here. You know, his antagonists are really social democracy here. That this is really what he's about, you know, in a sense, and really in another way, even direct democracy in some ways, you know, in some ways, right?
Yeah,
He
Korsch
really,
despised the SPD.
yeah. No, I know that. Yeah, but I mean, he Althusser, to go back to this again, is trying to say, look, this new continent is not just something I'm dreaming up. He's looking at this historically. So what is Marx and Engels in Manchester? They're in Manchester when they write the German ideology. What are they rupturing here? This new science that they call history, right? This is what he's trying to figure out. Outside of the historicist notions from Delphi to Gramsci, right? How does one begin to look at historia, historicity? You know, you have Heideggerian epochal configurations, the Althusserian that's more grounded in terms of the continents, right? Freud, the unconscious knows no time, right? All of these things, how do you bring this together into a kind of new science, a science of history? So this becomes the ruptural moment from Fourbacchian humanism, of which he sees people like Lukács, maybe to another degree Korsch, you know, I mean, I don't think he really commented on Korsch that much. Korsch was, you know, as you know, kind of kicked out, if you will. You know, yeah, and Panikak and others. So he's trying here to show this rupture, right? There's one break in 1917, which is the Leninist break. Where did that go wrong, right? He's looking at all the deviations and the reactions, etc., and trying to frame this again in that if you go back, you know, to bourgeois humanism, right, etc., you're not really connecting revolutionary theory for the revolutionary workers' moment. You'll still have a workers' movement, right? The unions will take over in all their reductionistic, economistic terms. These other institutions will take over, but the revolution is diluted. The revolution is dead if you don't have this. So he's always trying to think this through all the way up to the biggest revolution was 1876. I mean, 1867, I'm sorry. 1867, the advent of capital, right? So the mature Marx is really this rupture with Fourbacchian sensuous rationality, you know, terms such as alienation, such as objectification, reification, these kind of terms are still part of a humanistic approach, right? Even though it's valuable, right? But that Marx is way beyond that. The minute he starts going to the British Library and starts poring over industrial reports, he's thinking through the condition of the working class in England, you know, all these moments, all this research, etc. The rereading of Hegel's Science of Logic in order to get new categories. Well, I mean, the reading of this stuff is to generate new categories. You know, this is what radical imagination does. So in a way, he's promoting, if you will, the radical imagination to have categories adequate, you know, that correspond to the political, to the moment. Right? This is what he's really up to. Whether this is successful, whether he's right, is another story. This is only time tells, you know, whether these new concepts really work, such as, you know, the structural causality, you know, his use of Freud's theory of overdetermination, the notion of contradiction, you know, all these terms, the symptomatic reading, you know, are we always reading the symptoms of the culture? I mean, what's next from Trump? What's the next symptom here, right? So we learned that the Deutsche Bank's smart enough not to loan him money, right? I mean, you know, no wonder he wants out of NATO, right? Anyway, yeah. But anyway, I mean, you know, this, you know, what do we have? You know, what language do we have for, say, maybe even a new circuit of capital, which has been, you know, something I've thought about and, you know, talked to people about. Where do you get a language of the derivative? You know, what has capital morphed into, this fictitious brand of capital, but it's ficting, and it's ficting successfully. It's successful. This Amazon, you know, that's going to be built, that's going to be real concrete buildings in Queens, you know, but this is fictional capital. And Amazon just made a profit this year. That's the first time they've made profit in their history. You know, speaking of extraction of surplus value, right? How that really works. Amazon's a case study. I mean, we could sell this to Harvard Business School and all become really rich, or Wharton School of Finance, you know, in a sense. You know, the new model of surplus value. So anyway, this is the first rupture, if you will, the anti-humanistic moment, right? For him, for Althusser. Yeah,
But
because he begins to see the production of new concepts in Marx. So this begins to critique of political economy, the way the science of history is proposed, historical materialism, the German ideology, all this. Yeah, what were we going to say?
But Marx still started capital with the commodity and commodity fetishism. I mean, that's.
Yeah, but I mean, for Althusser, the battle starts with put that aside and let's look at what we all are still dealing with, this abstraction called money, and how it works, and how it's transformed into capital. This is where he wants to begin, the reading. So you get a whole slew of books, and I recommend one highly, who was a student of Deleuze, Capital Times by Eric Aliès. Yeah, which is a very interesting book about, you know, reading capital through the lens of, you know, capital.
How do you spell the last name?
Alliez, Eric. It's his first name. Yeah. And I recommend this book highly. It's a return to Aristotle's Chromastics and a reading of Marx kind of through that prism. And yeah, you know, so the question, what is money? What is the ontology of money? What is the movement from money to capital? Becomes a much more crucial question, and how does this play out in terms of dominance of structure? But structure also has to do not only just with reflection theory, that legal theory, jurisprudence, you know, all these things reflect base superstructural relations, but they become dominant in structure at a certain time. How do you undo that? Isn't that part of the strategy? So this becomes one of his models, this dominance in structure. What is the actual structure and dominance today? Yeah, what is really going on in terms of structural dominance, right? So this is a question we can ask. You know, and of course, look, he's going to say this rise of social democracy in the United States. Many people just say, oh, it's the best we got, let's take it. You know, we have a psychotic patient, so we got to give him some pills, him or her some pills to get him back to reality, right? Or to the symbolic order. And then other people say, this is just going to end up in the same old repetition as before. That's what the Althusserian's going to say about social democracy, about or these movements as you know. Yeah. So And Stanley will say the same thing because, you know, they made the mistake with the New American movement of collaborating with social democrats. Yeah, they made a big
DSA.
mistake. DSA, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. They made a big mistake. Stanley still even admits it. The first thing
Yeah.
he'll tell you. Yeah. Yeah.
He regrets
Yeah,
it.
yeah, regrets it. They had the right acronym, NAM. New American, Vietnam, you know? Yeah, going to the promised land, right? Anyway, so, let's keep this in mind, but let's see how he proceeds here, unless there are any other thoughts or questions or whatever. Listen, again, I know this is difficult. We're so accustomed through the ideological state apparatus of the educational system to always think in human terms. You know, he's trying to think and operate like a philosopher. And what does a philosopher do? Produce new concepts. This is what he's really trying to do, and saying that the Marxist, the moment here is to produce new concepts around the science of history. So let's look at it. So of course the easy part of without revolutionary theory, page 160, the Leninist moment.
Michael,
There's no practice. Yeah, I'm
just
sorry.
that dialogue with the FCP is one level that you can read this.
That's one. The next level would certainly be at the level of what's going on inside the philosophical movements, right, of bourgeois philosophy. You know how bourgeois philosophy is operating throughout, right? Yeah, because you have to recognize again, you know, for all of our great feelings about 1917, we still live in the bourgeois revolution, right? We're still living within this moment, and these are the weapons to which we have, you know, in order to undermine, but at the same time think well beyond. You know, we need certainly better explanatory models. So he's also in dialogue with quote unquote the bourgeois philosophers, right? In a sense. The other dialogue is with Lenin, right, himself, right, as being a philosopher who pulls off, you know, the old theory practice distinction. That this is really what Lenin signifies in terms of history, right? That he signifies or embodies, if you will, as a signifier, the one who is able to pull off political practice, right, with revolutionary theory, if you will, right? Yeah, he embodies this. And Lukács the same thing with Lenin. You know, he writes a little small monograph on, etc. So the correct union, right, of the revolution on correct, this is page 162, and he talks about all the problems in the First and Second International. And we're not even at the First International right now. I mean, unfortunately, we're trying to form the Fifth, but we're not really, you know, in terms of the society at the level of the First International, right? Workers of the world unite and right, etc. Right?
We're approaching the sixth extinction too.
We have the sixth extinction, and we need to form the Fifth International very quickly.
Barbara
Yeah.
Ehrenreich says it needs to be changed to workers of the world relax.
That's the Tony Negri position.
Oh.
That's very good.
Post-work.
That's not Althusser's position. Yeah, they have big differences. You know, Negri, you know, in a way, Althusser was very kind to Tony because he gave him a space to teach, you know, in exile after he was arrested and, you know, he left Italy. And the lessons on the Grundrisse were kind of like, you know, Negri's entry into Paris. Yeah, and, you know, then, you know, very much against the Leninist, vanguard in many ways. But we'll get to that too. Okay, so the struggle is always interminable. That's another thing. He wants to talk about this movement of workers with the union of Marxist theory and the workers' movement, right? This union, etc. So what does Lenin do against the First and Second International? Page 163. First, he struggles against deviations in the interpretation of Marxist theory in both historical materialism, and this is good. He defines the theoretical struggle against revisionists and populists. So if you have the populists today, if the populists are operative today, we have a left and a right populism. To Althusser and to Lenin, right, This is populism. This is not, unquote, theory, right? You need to struggle against this and show it for what it is, right? This is why I guess the Yellow Jackets movement, the Gilets Jaunes movement in Paris is interesting in the sense, is this a new kind of populism, or is this really an uprising that needs theoretical, base, right, in some senses? They are not attached to the unions at all. They really don't want the unions. There's a general strike plan for this Tuesday, of which the CGT is behind. The other union, the Macron union, is against the general strike.
Oh, surprise.
Yeah, big surprise. Yeah.
13,000 were in the streets of Paris today.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right. So anyway, but remember this in terms against revision and populists, right, of the First and Second International, and the dialectical materialism, and this is the philosophy. Remember, diamat or dialectical materialism is always the philosophical arm of historical materialism. And the dialectical materialism, it's always as a movement, is trying to catch up, or is in this lag time, this delayed action in relation to historical materialism, and certainly in relation to science. But for science, again, equated with historical materialism for Althusser, right? It's not just the science of physics or the science of, astrophysics or organic chemistry. It's the science as history. Okay, in this way, Lenin restored Marxist theory and its specificity and its purity, and treated it as a true science, developing and using it to produce theoretical discoveries. And the new discovery was the category, even though Lenin didn't invent the word, he certainly expanded upon it, imperialism. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what he's talking about. You don't have the theories of imperialism in any kind of dense way until Lenin comes along and creates this new category in which we can see it. Hobson, when he developed the theory of imperialism, did not talk about it as the highest stage of capital, right? Lenin did, right? Of which, some of you know, Hilferding has an argument with him about this on the basis of finance capital, which is still a debate we live through today, which is kind of interesting, somewhat. Okay, secondly, Lenin defined a new political line. So you have both the new concept, right, the production of a new concept in the radical imagination, that's analytically useful, but secondly, the political line, new forms of organization. Bolshevik Party and the Third International. These are new forms, right, of political organization. So he's pointing this out. Again, this is the Leninist break in the 20th century that most people have not been through. Right? I mean, remember this too. Certainly not our friends in DSA. Right? Right? This is interesting that, you're dealing with breaks here that you have to undergo, right, in a sense, psychically, materially, in a sense, in order to say, okay, let's go on to the next level of what we're going to establish as new concepts, right? In many ways, right? So how can you think as a radical unless you understand that everything in bourgeois culture and everything that has really gone on geopolitically has been, at least for the last 100 years, right, an attempt to make sure 1917 never happens again. Right? I mean, in many ways, that's the great reaction that happened in the 20th century.
I mean,
politically.
you do have a lot of people playing at Leninism,
Yeah, I'm not saying, I'm not saying it has to be Leninism. I'm talking about witnessing the break. I think we have to go way beyond Lenin. At this point,
What are you referring to?
Yeah.
Well, I'm referring to the sectarians. I mean,
I like them.
they're all.
Oh, I see what.
Yeah, they're
okay.
all playing at being Leninists.
Yeah.
As if it were 1917. all
It's
over.
not. But the problem
And
again
if you would
here.
just join, it would happen.
Yeah. Go breed the Bolsheviks in the latrine. Yeah. Right.
Uncle Carl wants you.
Yeah. So, look, the point here is that this is something one undergoes, right, theoretically, and then one is thinking through new moments, right, in a sense, new strategies. Yes, it's impossible to use a Leninist break today. I mean, great organizer, no question. The party formation, worthy of study, etc. Yeah, but,
But it's not 1917 anymore.
it's not 1917, that's right. Yeah. Alcoa aluminum's not as powerful as it used to be. Andrew Carnegie's been dead a long time, yeah. U.S. Steel
But
is
his
not what it
institute
used to be.
lives on.
That's right, that's right. The Gilded Age is long behind us, even though everybody, this is how bad the bourgeoisie is. It always has to come up with concepts that are based in the past. The new Gilded Age. Just think of what's going on, Black Monday. How many times people are going to use Black Friday and Black Monday on Wall Street? They can't come up with something else, right? Today Trump tweeted at 11:32 X, Y, and Z, and the market fell 85 points, right? Something like that. Crazy. So anyway, the political line. So it did not imply that then existing Marxist concepts. This is what its first point is here in the historical task of vis-a-vis Lenin. He produced in rigorous fashion new theoretical, scientific, and philosophical concepts in order to solve the problems that history put before him, translated this into a political practice. So we draw conclusions from this. Of course, the first conclusion, without the existence, would have remained a dead letter, but without Lenin's theoretical struggle and production, without his discoveries, this analysis, his definition of the new forms of organizations, would not have, without this, you would not have the union of theory with the Russian workers' movement, right? Yeah, please.
Now,
Yeah.
when you talk about the Leninist rupture,
Yeah.
are you referring specifically to the April theses? Or?
Yes, April theses, and of course, the absolute destruction of the humanistic Mensheviks in a way too, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then it's a rupture also away from we're going to wait, right, until it's the right time, versus that of what Lenin is really doing. He's bringing theory into practice, right, and reading the moment in a very correct way. Yeah.
But the irony is part of the moment was the Great War, and Lenin subsequently said the revolution could never have taken place without the war.
History is a process without a subject. It
Or
happened,
a
yeah.
multitude of subjects.
Right, multitude, well, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, in a way, that kind of objective condition is read very carefully by him.
Yeah.
And the Germans understood this because they paid his travel back into Moscow.
It's like
right?
Birthright or something.
Yes, exactly, yeah. But you read Marx, we're gonna help you out and get you back into Russia and put him into practice, so who knows, yeah. But anyway, yeah. All right, so, and you can read between the lines here, there is this argument going on with spontaneism and Luxemburgism, right, at another level. That
Is
he's
that,
also,
is that an equivalent, spontaneism and Luxemburgism?
well, I mean, to Lenin it was. I mean, spontaneity was not something that you advocated for, or spontaneity at the base, and he got into debates with Rosa Luxemburg about this. So Althusser is much more Leninist than he is Luxemburgian in this moment, right? He's going to go very much against spontaneism, and ultimately.
But I mean,
yeah.
she wasn't just.
No, of course not. They're much closer than people think,
really, yeah.
if you read it carefully, I mean, in my estimation. All right, so anyway, to go back here, the two domains of Marxist theory, and these are the two main domains, again, the science of history, historical materialism, and dialectical materialism, those two, and how he did. So that's the second conclusion here, that Lenin was able to work both ends, right, of historical materialism and dialectical materialism. The third is that it's producing not only new knowledge, the third conclusion, 164, but also new theoretical concepts. And this is the important thing. That Althusser is always looking for the production of new theoretical concepts, those that will become adequate to the demand of the object. That's a very Spinoza's position, that the idea, you have to have an adequation between thing, idea, and object, right? And, this is really where he's coming from. And this is, ultimately, there's no mention of Spinoza here, but, we can go into this a little more next time about causality in Spinoza, and the lack of teleology. When Althusser says history is a process without a subject, he's also arguing against teleology, eschatology, etc. He's arguing very much against finality, right? Very, very important to keep this in mind. Yeah. So, okay. So existing concepts, and he gives examples here: Tsarist Russia before 1905, new class relations after 1905, 1917. One limits oneself to using existing scientific concepts without producing new ones. So if we just talk about the date of Roe versus Wade, or we just talk about this is happening in this particular period, we're still not really producing new theoretical concepts. Then we can only say increase the sum of existing knowledge, not to have developed theory. And this is a swipe somewhat at Hegel, in terms of the spiraling dialectic and the accumulation and the movement of knowledge, as a process of, taking all of knowledge, the passage to absolute knowing, but you're not really developing a theory around it, right? So he goes on that, treat Marx, a paragraph below that, two paragraphs down, thus to treat Marx's theory as a scientific theory, to enrich it, to first increase the stock of knowledge that it allows us to acquire. It increases the knowledge, things become regionally, important, right? That it allows us to acquire, and then to develop the theory itself, that is to develop theoretical concepts. So everything's fair game for study, right? And in depth, right? At the same time, producing new theoretical concepts. And he calls this theoretical practice, right? That you take the existing stock of knowledge, right? But you're going to create a new theory or a theoretical concept. This is, again, part of radical imagination at work. How do you produce the new theoretical concepts, right? Okay, so going further down, a scientific theory is therefore an open-ended discipline. An ideology, in contrast, is a closed system. So he distinguishes here, very interestingly, about science and ideology. This distinction is that science is open-ended, right? Whereas ideology is closed. It closed, nothing new. So we always, repetition, right, is part of the ideological state apparatus, reproducing itself, etc. Very much like Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Technical Reproduction, that the bourgeoisie, how many Disney Part 5s do you have to have? How many franchises? Black Panther will have Black Panther 2 coming soon. Already in contract, right? Yeah, Planet of the Apes. Look how far we've come from the apes to the Black Panther in terms of franchise. Think about this in terms of what this language is producing in the unconscious. I mean, people don't talk about this, but you think about this. You've got Caesar in the Planet of the Apes, and then you've got this whole new thing about the riches of Africa and Black Panther now being thing. Think of the animal world, what's really being said here, what's being franchised, and how a generation is going to be, completely brainwashed by this educational state apparatus.
And when I was in Venezuela, the big thing was for the opposition to bring pet monkeys to their demonstrations. The monkey represented Chavez's indigenous roots.
Yeah,
And so they would all have
yeah.
monkeys, they would be on their shoulders, they'd be decked out, little hats. It was really
Yeah.
funny.
Wow.
They had little competitions, who had the best monkey.
Who had the organ? Right. So anyway, so this distinction is made on page 165, which is very important for Althusser. Science as open-ended discipline, right? Closed system is ideology. And he's picking this up from a reading of Alexander Corret's great book, From the Closed Universe to the From the Closed System to the Open Universe, his book on science, Corret, on scientific inquiry. Okay, so never season.
So good. That's kind of startling what he says here about ideology.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a reference to the communists, I assume, that they're closed and they have stopped evolving?
I think it's a reference to both. I think you can use it both ways, that ideology, the way he's constructing this as a philosopher, is working both in the advanced capitalist countries as well as in dogmatism in the parties.
Oh,
Yeah, I think it's both.
oh, okay.
I mean, I may be wrong about that, but I think that's his intention, that he's actually trying to draw out a science ideology
So both
distinction.
bourgeois ideology and
Right.
closed
Right.
communist ideology.
Right,
could-
and
or
also,
Stalinism.
I mean, Sartre makes a great distinction between the dogmatic dialectic and the critical dialectic. And Althusser is kind of working with us in some ways, that the critical dialectic is much closer to the science, right, whereas the dogmatic dialectic becomes closer to ideology, yeah, in a way. And you can begin to see this. This goes back to Plato in so many ways, about you can have a right and a wrong opinion in terms of a doxa. And on your way to knowledge, to episteme, or on the way to science, is always kind of, you have to take the right path, right, in a sense. So it's kind of guiding outside of the prejudice and the superstition and the repetition is really very important. That's the first step is always very important. Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
he talk a lot about the difference between ideology and philosophy, or?
Yeah, I mean, what he's really doing here is this, is trying to demarcate a Marxist philosophy, if you will, from ideology, right? And, basically showing this. I mean, for example, you take a language like, this is the way I think sometimes, not always, but anyway, the People's Forum. Now, the People's Forum yields a kind of bourgeois humanism, right, in a way, because people is a term of the French Revolution. It's Rousseauist, right, in a way. It privileges the fact that somehow that we are noble souls, right? It doesn't take into account, anything about critical mass, critique, etc. So it just becomes a gathering, quote unquote, of the people, without the notion of the sovereign or the general will, is how Rousseau articulates it in a process. This is why language becomes very important, I think. Going forward. So I'm not advocating they change their name, but anyway, it just goes to show you how people are so not really careful, right, in what they do, because the People's Forum could include so much, right, that there's no new theoretical force going on. Yeah. Okay. So it's a Rousseauist movement at best.
Yeah.
Populist.
You have to kind of take people where they are.
Yeah, no, I understand this.
You know?
I understand this. But he's not thinking this way,
No.
taking people where they are. This is not what the theoretical
He's not an organizer.
Marxist
He's a
is
philosopher.
about. Yeah, the wife was the organizer. Yeah. Anyway,
Well, she's dead.
yes. I had to get that in. And I knew you were going yeah. Miss Althusser, she dead, huh? Yeah. Good point, right. I know. Another Heart of Darkness story.
There's something so funny about that.
Right. Anyway, so again, yes, the stock of knowledge, which you're talking about again, is one sense of this, increasing the stock of knowledge about what's out there, but at the same time, unless you have new theoretical concepts, according to Althusser, you're not going to get anywhere in terms of a revolutionary movement. You have a movement, but will it be revolutionary? Yeah. That's the question, right? In some ways. Yeah. So anyway, so this is the beginning, and then the final conclusion, the political practice, right? Right? You need a correct conception of Marxist science and philosophy and their relationship. This is on the bottom of 166. And that ultimately it's the fate, right, of the socialist revolution itself. So he makes really strong pronouncements here. You can see if the audience is philosophy in the Soviet Union, he's talking about the future of communism in that country as well, or the movement, globally, right? Many ways. Never went to England. I don't think he always went east. Yeah, went to Italy, and loved Italy, and went to the Soviet Union many times. So anyway, The struggle, page 167, the last paragraph, the struggle for the defense and development of Marxist theory, the struggle for its rigor and fecundity is always a crucial factor in the revolutionary struggle. In certain critical conjunctures, it can even be, as it was in Lenin's day, the determinant factor in that struggle. So Althusser is trying to privilege philosophy sometimes as being the determinant factor. You know, that the thinking apparatus can become very, very crucial in a revolutionary struggle. Okay, the next thing is the theoretical politics. This is when he brings up the notion of conjuncture, right? And you know, he does say this, and this is the attack on you know, the lack of a vanguard. Left to their own devices, right? The workers will end up in trade unionism or social democratic reformism, and this is what happens, unfortunately. Unfortunately, you know, in many ways, you know, democracy becomes basically a buzzword for defeatism. You know, that you will be defeated, unfortunately. Yeah. So anyway, but we can talk more about that. Okay, the analysis of general political and ideological theoretical conjuncture struggle to establish itself. So it has the structure of the conjuncture, something we need to talk about more and more, and its dominant and subordinate elements. So someone could really write a good piece. Why do we have already announced 6 candidates for the Democratic Party and 2 possible independent billionaires? Starbucks and you know, big donor to Johns Hopkins. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Why do we have this going on right now?
It's
What is
amazing.
this structure in dominance that's producing? Yeah.
But also,
Just Trump?
It's amazing the vitriol that's directed at Schultz, is it? The Starbucks? No, is it the Starbucks? Schultz. Yeah,
Starbucks man.
Starbucks man. I mean,
From Brooklyn.
really, yeah. I mean, Krugman opened up on him with more venom than I've ever seen him directed at anybody else. I mean,
Yeah,
he's a threat to the Democrats, basically.
yeah, I think it's really a symptom of the crisis.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and someone like Krugman just equates him with Jill Stein.
Well, the most radical person in the move is a moral crusader, Elizabeth Warren. That's the most radical person that's in the mix right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine that she, calls out people, but it's a kind of new moralism. It's just not right what goes on. And those of you that know Peter Bratzis and Choukoulas's work in particular, corruption is part of the system. It's nothing new, in a sense. And if you only run campaigns on that level, you're not going to really get anywhere. That's exactly what people want. In a sense, you basically are taking, you're saying in a way that, the state, this is Negri's position, by the way, that the state itself, can be changed to run things more efficiently. That there's nothing wrong with capitalism in and for itself. It's the people that are managing things, And some Marxists privilege capitalism as an irrational system. It doesn't matter if it's irrational or rational. The question is, it needs to be destroyed. I mean, to the mind that's thinking this way, in a sense. And the state should not be involved. So, when you get these moral crusaders, this is wrong, Trump did this. How much paper and time on TV is wasted on the Russiagate and the Trump lack of taxes? It's all we hear about. We don't hear everything about issues. It's all about, what the as if this is really going to do something. As Sakur said, you're not going to get anywhere. They have no moral conscience, these people. You tell them that what they're doing is wrong. Give me a break. I mean, like they're going to get up at night and take some Valium or whatever they take, high-powered drugs to put them back to sleep, because they have a moral conscience, because people demonstrate it out there. You think, in all honesty, they're going back to the drawing board. You look at, listen, the way, it's a great thing you have the yellow vest, but you should be thinking also, what is Macron and his advisors devising with the police to keep this down? You have to think this dialectically, because if you're not thinking it dialectically, you're going to be swept away, by, this great movement in a sense. Yeah? How is the police and how are the quote, the dominant financial class, going to, put this down? What are they thinking of? What's on the drawing board, etc.
Well, one thing.
And what would be considered a victory to the left in this case? I mean, these to me are very important questions that aren't really raised, in some ways. Instead, it's this movement. Then they're looking for things in the past to identify it, And Althusser's right in a sense, unless you're producing new theoretical concepts, or you're really going somewhere, that's adequate to the times. Go ahead, David. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I just saw a reference to another movement called the Red Scarves.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone is.
Yeah, I saw,
You know,
yeah.
is that a possible counter movement, or sort of a right wing?
That could be part of the
No,
move.
they're-
That could be part of Macron's move.
Yeah.
They send these people in,
Anti-violence.
yeah, to tell
Yeah.
them not to riot.
Yeah.
Right,
Let's have
Yeah.
a civil exchange.
It's ridiculous.
Or
There's-
provocateurs.
We
There's-
believe in the revolution.
There's
We
negative
believe in
on
your
both
revolution.
sides,
But
both
there's a
sides.
way of doing this,
There's a proper
Michael,
way.
don't speak too loud in that meeting,
Yeah.
Be soft. We have to convince people.
Also, Elizabeth Warren, to distinguish herself from the Social Democrats, said that she's capitalist to the bone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's what she
I mean,
said.
she's the
Yeah.
most
So remember
radical
that.
one in the mix.
Yeah.
Long before she declared as a candidate, yeah.
Yeah, to the bone.
You're gonna have to give her lessons about Narrow,
Exactly. There's an inside.
My nerves.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah, I wasn't here when you did Gramsci, but it's been heartbreaking to me to read a lot of history around, what happened to Gramsci in that whole period. Because at the time that the Communist Party was arguing so much within itself,
Yes.
the fascists were just planning how to destroy
yes,
them. and kill
I mean,
them.
this is always important to remember. I mean, here we are, the disaster called Ronald Reagan, and all the left, a little bit of opposition, but where did it get anybody? Nobody really did a, serious analysis. There were a few good articles, some good books that came out, but in terms of mobilization, you remember 83 or 82, the big march against nuclear war. That's when Thompson wrote Writing by Candlelight about the no nuke movements, etc. Right? Now you had these marches, you had protests, you had some resistance, but never any kind of new theories. What is going on the other side. And as we know now, Mr. Griffin, who lives in London and has the $300 million penthouse, I know that this has been put out, the hedge fund guy, I forgot the name, Citadel hedge funds, right? In a sense. These are people who were, operating completely, under the radar for so many years. And they scapegoat a few people. You have the London whale. You have this guy, over here. A few people that they scapegoat were the bad apples in the mix. But this is a 40, 50-year plan that's been going on. Again, student loans. Nobody was an indentured servant if you went to school and tried to get a graduate degree in the 70s. Late the 60s through the 70s. But come the 80s, everybody, started to accumulate debt like nobody's business. What does that do to the mind? Despite the fact, unless you're a revolutionary and say, I ain't paying this shit, that can come out, I don't need a credit card or whatever, I'm going to continue to read, struggle, and write, and all of this. Most people are trapped by this. They end up working, a good part of their lives just to pay back, which in most countries is a right. And this is pulled off here. And you look at what is the political class that's been elected here?
But debt is discipline. It's nothing new. The mortgage was debt is discipline.
Uh-huh. That's right. Yeah, of course.
That's an old trick.
Yeah, well, mortgage means to gamble on one's death in French.
Huh.
Wage death. Mortgage. Yeah. Gauging your death. M-O-R-T and G-A-G-A. Yeah. Gamble on your death. Make a wager.
That's interesting
On
where
your death.
Ralph
Till death
Miliband-
do us part, right?
What about Ralph Miliband?
Oh, just where his sons are today.
Yeah.
Where are
Oh,
they?
well.
Oh,
They're in England.
Capitalists.
Oh, I think
They're near
what are they
Rory's,
doing?
Head of the Labour-
the brain
Labour
and the
Party,
flop.
yeah.
Huh?
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually, we're fighting to replace each other as who would be the next head of labor.
But, I mean, there seem to be two things that the left doesn't really want to touch in terms of really moving forward with any force. One is the question of violence. You know, this is really a question that is never really broached in a way, in a way. You know, what really is necessary at a certain historical stage? The right has no problem with this. Look at Elliot Abrams, The Ghost in the Machine, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
No,
No
make sure
problem
a lot
at
of
all.
people die.
Look at this guy Bolton. I mean, in a sense, they have no, and it's so transparent. They used to hide it a little bit. Now they just come out and say it. We want to privatize the oil. We want this back into corporations' hands. Hell with this. Yeah, it was a very lucrative deal for the corporations to begin with.
Yeah.
To deal with the government. So now they want it more even more lucrative. Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah.
really amazing how
Yeah.
blatantly this whole thing is going.
And then the other one, with all due respect to sectarianism and et cetera, and I don't think it should be encouraged so much, but you do need polemics, and you need good polemics, because that's where thinking is in that polemical moment, right? Which literally means, opposition, war, in some translations of the Greek, but it really means in opposition to the polemos that's in Heraclitus. War. Polemos is the father of all things. You don't really have birth without that. That's what we learned from the pre-Socratics. It's like you can't grow as a human being unless there's some pain. So that's another thing that everybody to me, shies away from. You get in arguments on Twitter and on the email and all of this, but in terms of sustained polemics, very little. Yeah. I mean, very little. In the voice of the Democratic Party, Paul Krugman. Another example. I'm sorry Stanley's not here because he'd really go to, but anyway, yeah. But he's really the voice of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, He's going to become basically a Warren supporter or something along that ilk, and everybody's already saying anybody but Trump, in a way. And is that what you're reduced to? I mean, that's another problematic area when you get those kind of slogans, in a way. I mean, he's had the greatest sustained stock market advance. I mean, he's made a lot of people rich. He's kept a lot of pensions going. I mean, you have to remember.
Not recently.
What's that?
Not recently.
No, this month was phenomenal.
Maybe not so much.
January was phenomenal
It
for Versus.
took back the losses.
Took back the
Yeah.
losses like this.
It's
Yeah.
better.
You haven't looked at your Apple stock
I gave
recently,
up-
Dave.
I gave up checking.
Yeah, I mean,
checking.
you see, that's what happens.
In
That's how they
December,
fool
we did
you,
well.
man.
Yeah.
That's how they fool you.
They fooled me. I stopped looking.
Right. Anyway, look, again, I think this notion of the conjuncture is very important. First, what are the elements of the conjuncture? What is the dominant structure? Look, at one level, this is playing out like a farce, right? It's like the 18th Brumaire. Elliot Abrams, these people from ghosts from the blast from the past, right, coming up, oh yeah, the crypt, yeah, tales, you're better, yeah, tales from the rights
It's
and
a
the
better
rights crypt.
image for
Yeah,
the way that man
that's true.
looks. I
It's
mean,
true. You're right about that. Yeah.
He looks
I don't look at their
skeletal.
faces
Oh, you
long
always
enough to
did.
do that, but I'm glad you do. Yeah. So anyway, so the conjuncture is very important, and then the analysis of the status of the theory. Where is the theory? So again, he's talking to, what is going on in building a Marxist philosophy, how difficult this really is, in both the capitalist and the balance sheet of its present strengths and weaknesses, right? So, he's solid in this way. I mean, he's really, he's a kind of comandante, right? In a way, he's saying, we've got to draw up, what the balance sheet is. How have we advanced, how haven't we? A critical, historical, and theoretical examination for the reasons for the results, the successes, the failures, and the shortcomings. And this is very honest. I mean, this is one thing I've always liked about Althusser. So anyway, then he goes to his thesis. It's simple, page 169. Marxist philosophy today represents, this is 1967, this is 50 years ago, 51 years ago, represents the decisive link on which depend the future of Marxist theory and, consequently, the correctness, in inverted commas, of the union of Marxist theory and the workers' movement. This is his thesis. So he's really going to position himself, look, at one level he's positioning himself where he's going to begin to perform this corrective to the Soviet Union and to those, people in the West that have, taken up the humanistic temptation. Okay? So then the next section, overcoming the lag, right? You can see down on the page there that dialectical materialism objectively lags behind historical materialism in its theoretical development. So the scientific and the historical materialism is much more developed before philosophy comes into its own with this. Secondly, it's not only the solution to a number of important theoretical problems, but the way we pose them. And this is elementary philosophy, elementary Heidegger, who I think is one of the most interesting on this. What philosophy is really about, and it's 90% of the battle, is to pose the question properly. How do we pose the question? Because most of the times we're just looking for answers, and we don't really think through how to ask the question. Yeah? So Venezuela would be a great example of this. How do we proceed with that kind of asking the question properly about what Venezuela signifies, not only to the movement at large, but what it signifies in the conjuncture, what it signifies towards the future, etc.
And there's an interesting piece actually in The Nation of all places, by Greg Grandin, basically
Right.
saying that what he sees this is an attempt to reformulate neoliberalism, to basically use use an attack on Venezuela.
So we're gonna listen to the Clash again. That's those Washington Bullets again, huh? Yeah, the
Possible.
Washington Consensus
Quite
is being
possible,
reworked here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 1973 policies are, now being reworked for the day. Okay, yeah. Okay, well, I mean, that's, I guess, one way.
Well, that's one viewpoint.
Yeah. So this is what he's really gonna try to do here. So, the way we pose the questions and the problems that follow the province and other sciences, okay? So anyway, then it's fallen far behind. He looks at Lenin's thinking here. Dialectical materialism should stay one step ahead. Actually, it's fallen behind, right? So again, this is the conversation with those in the Soviet Union, the philosophical community. That's what he's really doing here, right? Yeah. Okay. The objective paradox of the dialectical materialism and the way we propose it in relation to historical materialism. Okay, so this is very, very hard-boiled. Okay, so then he goes through the enemies list. What do I call the enemies list? During's humanistic idealism, the empirical criticism, page 171, historicist subjectivism of Lenin's adversaries, were historical obstacles, and he's looking at, how this, should be called out and played out in the moment. And then he goes on, I wait for Beth, because capital, he does speak about capital here, of philosophy, offers the most striking example. That's nothing even remotely comparable to capital. But it's not only the question of the quantity, this is 170 of the text available, the question of the quality of what they contain. And he wants to look at the difference in theoretical elaboration. How do we do this qualitatively differently, right? As Marx calls the abstract forms and the order of exposition. And this is one of the great moments in Marx, and again, maybe I should wait. Marx distinguishes between the method of research and the method of presentation. A very important distinction. How does one build a constellation in terms of how one goes about one's method of research? This accumulated knowledge that he speaks of. This is Marx speaking here, Beth, in terms of the ways of approaching an object. And Althusser citing this. The method of research, right, versus that of the method of presentation, or how both are working out, right, in a sense, right? Okay, so this accumulated knowledge is here. The production of new conceptual forms is in the method of presentation. So when Marx, since you like the first part of Capital, or you think it's, important, is going to begin with the commodity as form. He's the first to do that, and breaking down the commodity into use value and exchange value, and showing utility versus that of modes of exchange, and then developing a whole category around fetishization of the commodities, and that's where the secret is in some ways. Okay, so anyway, so this is very important for Althusser, because he's really working off of this. I mean, if this was a not such an advanced group of people, I would probably just begin here and say, this is the crux, if you will, of, what he's really trying to do in terms of dialectical and historical materialism. Dialectical materialism and historical materialism. So philosophy, right, is supposed to be in here where you produce new conceptual terms. This is where the radicality really is. The other is the acquired knowledge. What do we know about Venezuela? What do we know about its history? What do we know about the past Washington consensus? What do we know about how they're thinking in the State Department? All of this. But the real question is, how does we produce new concepts? How do we present this and get a much greater understanding? And how can you tie this to a movement? How do you get a political line out of this? This is what he's really trying to do.
I like the way he made I don't remember where it was,
Yeah,
but he
sure.
made the comparison with historians. He said, for instance, someone who's a historian for slavery wants to look at the concept formation during that period of time. The
Yes.
structure and the concept.
Yes.
And he's saying we have to do no less for the current period.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. And I just want to mention too here that Foucault at this time is writing the order of things, right? Foucault is writing a structuralist track as this is going on. Okay, so this is very interesting in France, because in France, unlike here in the States, right, there's this battle over methodology ever since Descartes' discourse on the method, which I think produces some real active thinking and very interesting polemics, very stimulating. Whereas here, we have a different kind of acceptance. Let's accumulate the facts, discuss them, etc. We're still immersed in a kind of empirico-positivism here. That's been since day one in the educational system. Whereas in France, you have Althusser, writing this to the Soviet Union, for the Soviet Union, but it becomes published here in the later works. And 1967, Foucault is doing Words and Things, right? The Order of Things translated, Le Mots des Choix, in French. And Derrida is starting to emerge as a real figure, starting to publish. The Talcal group is getting going, right? So you have many, many moments here that are all happening at once. But the structuralist moment is really levied. And Lacan has already given his 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis lecture, at this point, right? So I think it's very interesting to contextualize it that way, and around how does one present, what Beth was, talking about, how does one historically present? What is the debate about how does one do history, right, basically? How does one do history, and how does one read history, right? And then how does one, in the Althusserian corpus, how does one take that historical materialism and make it available in terms of dialectical materialism to the workers' revolutionary movement? Not just to, quote, a critique of the unions, right? Not only just a critique of trade unionism, economistic thinking, all of these kind of things, new forms of populism, etc. But how does one link up with new concepts to give, you know, give to the,
The one thing I thought
Yeah.
about
Yeah,
when I was
sure.
reading what he was saying about history, one thing that came to mind were these sisters, the Field sisters, Barbara and Karen, and they write kind of about racism, anti-essentialism in racism, and how racism is produced. It's something which is
Right.
socially created, and one of their statements is, the plantation was not about producing white supremacy.
well, they're right.
That was not the intended
No.
production. The production, exactly, it was material.
How Master doing today? We're fine, yeah, how everything with you? Yeah, I grew up in that nonsense, yeah.
But I think it's
Yeah.
I mean, it.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It's
Overkill,
not
but-
really about the white supremacy, etc. And this is where Quentin Tarantino and like Django Unchained is really missing the point in some ways. You know, it really was about, you know, the economy. It was about, you know, basically, you know, the you know, King Cotton, you know, what it yielded. Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
But in the South and Haiti and other places too, initially there were black or mulatto slave owners.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean.
New Orleans,
Yeah,
for
of
first
course.
free people
Right.
to color in Treme.
Okay.
This show that
Yeah.
David Simon did after The
Yeah.
Wire.
So it was clearly economic at that point, but at a certain point,
Yeah.
it began to undergo a qualitative change, and any non-white people who were masters
Yeah.
gotten
It's a
rid
funny
of.
story about Treme, by the way.
Yeah.
The free people of color, there was a church,
Mhm.
and the whites and the free people of color did.
Yeah.
But the free people of color wanted to take over the church. They wanted the church for themselves. So they brought more slaves to the church and the seating and pushed out the whites.
Well,
It's kind of interesting, right?
It's a-
They played the same old game, you know? right?
It's a reverse of the,
Yeah.
the voting.
Right,
voting
right.
quote. But again, I would say in that turn towards complete racist, division, then you can say it's more than just economic. Then at that point, what enters into it is notions of race and white supremacy.
Well,
Here-
something's
here-
invented in order to keep the, the capital accumulation.
rebellion.
Yeah. To go to the top, right? I mean, it's really you have to invent something, right,
Yeah.
to keep that ideology going.
Right, yeah,
Right.
so it becomes more strict and,
Right.
the lines.
Right. I mean, when William Rodin wrote the book on Michael Jordan, the $40 million slave, on the, I mean, in a
Yeah.
way, he had some real truth there, in a sense, right? I mean, that kind of covers both of the,
Mm-hmm.
the moments, right?
Yeah.
In a sense. I mean, I have a thing, I've been thinking about this too, because I always wondered what the hell went wrong, after the, with all the theoretical ammunition and the armature that was available in the early 70s, et cetera. How did everything turn so quickly, and how did this move in a way? Well, when you start looking at things, David Geffen, who was Electros Island Records and now is today a multi-billionaire, right? He gave a course at Yale at the School of Management. 10 times the amount of students are going to this class, right, than they are to the humanities classes or courses in politics. You begin to see free agency, sports taking over as a new kind of model. America's getting into training, this whole emphasis on the body, the new political technology and capital appropriation of the body. All of these things start to happen, reverse discrimination, the Defundus, the case, the guy that didn't get into medical school.
up in,
You begin to
Wisconsin,
see
whatever,
this,
yeah.
the advent of the student loans. All of these things start to kind of coalesce, and then you have the election. I mean, Carter is kind of like the last human cry of a liberalism gone amok, right? I mean, you know, of the Great Society.
I mean,
Right?
Carter-
No, of course, I am.
Carter was the first, well, he wasn't the first, but he was, you know, really he had the stamp of neoliberalism, you know. And the whole trilateral moment.
Yeah, of course, yeah, no, I mean, I understand all this, but the question is how does the ideology shift, right? How did this apparatus shift so radically, right, into this? You know, I mean, how did this shift so quickly? How did this come back after, you know, for a while, totally critiqued? Came back with a vengeance. I mean, you know, really with a real vengeance in a sense. Yeah, and you know, how does this happen, etc. And what are the books that are popular during the 70s and from the academics? Culture of Narcissism, Lash, you know, Pursuit of Loneliness, Philip Slater. You know, these are the books that become, you know, very popular items, right? In a way, Age of Desire, Joe Covell, that was a little later, but white racism was, I guess, during that period. You know, what's going on? So in a way, I mean, look, you can mark in some ways, when does this start to really break down? You know, in a sense, you know, this is the kind of question I pose to myself. When does this break down as a very rigorous attempt to look at what's happening and how does things get displaced, right? Where the business school becomes the come on rather than the humanities or the poetics of the future. How does the poetry of the future get displaced by the pension? Right, I mean, this I think it's a good question. How does that happen? How does that economism, how does that economistic thinking come out and, you know, at this point, right, in a way? Yeah, but go ahead, I'm not saying I have an answer, I'm just posing the question in a few little elements.
Well, I think they were very aware that they had to change they had to, the bourgeoisie really had to move away from, they realized they had a problem, you know, with, so you had the Carnegie Conference on Education that basically, in 1975,
Right.
that you're gonna reorient education away from the humanitarian, away from the humanities.
Right.
And you know, the school that I went to, it went from being a humanities institution to being a research institution. You know, it was supposedly, I mean, it was never, well, the University of California never was anything but a research institution.
Well, yeah.
But Santa Cruz was supposed to be this place where they,
I almost went
where they
there.
allowed some humanity.
Yeah,
But
but
they
look,
changed.
Yeah, but again, the
They decided
question,
against that.
the question is that there was this massive displacement,
Yeah.
right, from one cultural mix, right, one cultural site to another. Everything became back to the suits, back to Brooks Brothers, back to, you know, think about all this going on, you know, in a very short period and how it's remobilized. What was it as a not only as a reactionary formation, a major reaction, but what was the ammunition and the ideology that's used, you know, from, like I said, the poetry of the future, right? You know, we're interested in creating the poetics and the poetry, the creativity of the future, versus that of, you know, give us safety with pensions and, you know, a good living and the quote good life that's based on what restaurants you frequent or what, you know, yeah, what kind of car you drive or what kind of, you know, second residence you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? This is an interesting, I think a very interesting question. And how did the schools, how does this get reinforced? And now it's so embedded in the culture, you know, even though you have these sporadic movements, right? It still seems to favor the balance of forces so much to the right, right? And to the neo-right, right? Because it's been so embedded in the discourse, now is at the point, think about this too. You know, I mean, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with all due respect, and you know, I admire the fight and that she can talk and stand up, but where would she be if this was 1972? You know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah, in a certain way. Why has this created this big, moment at this point? What are we really doing at this point? So I think this is what an Althusser, if you want to, since he's the imminent reading today, so to speak, he would be thinking it, trying to think through these elements, if you will. What are these elements that are going on? What is this new populist temptation? What is the new economism, etc.? And are we really talking about this, in a sense?
Well, I think,
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
1972, there was no, the idea was the institutions were so corrupt that, you weren't going to try to seize them, like the French students marching by
Yeah, I
the
mean-
halls of power
Yeah.
and not going in.
I'm just trying to, again, trace how dominant this is.
Yeah.
Now Foucault said, he was against ideology. He thought that this became part of what, and I know we're not doing him, but I think it's interesting because this became a real debate of the epistemic, the epistemes, and you probably know this very well, that the episteme, itself, right, set up discursive regularities, right, and ideology was for simpletons, right, in a way, his swipe at Althusser, right? I mean, they don't spare each other, even though they're, Poulan and Foucault, they would not even look at each other in the hallway at the Sorbonne.
Say it again.
Yeah. Poulan and Foucault would not even look at each other. I mean,
And what was the basis of that?
well, they argued. They were on different sides of the, theoretical seesaw, so to speak. Right?
Well, Poulantzas was a student of Althusser's.
No.
No?
Althusser, no, he never was he was a kind of collaborator on the outside. He was a student of Merleau-Ponty's, by the way. Yeah.
Not the right
He was a
word, but-
student of Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Oh.
But Althusser used to tell everybody, how come you guys, of the Reading Capital Group, Poulantzas is always ahead of you.
Oh.
He used to say that. Poulantzas was the model for the political line. How come you don't write like Poulantzas? He's always ahead of us. What's wrong with us? All this.
Oh, no
this
wonder they hated him.
Yeah. Well, that was Foucault.
My
Foucault.
father used to say that shit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
they could start
So,
rivalry
yeah.
all over the
Really?
place. Sure.
Yeah.
I have to go, I just want to.
Yeah, sure.
There's a panel discussion at the Casa Italiana on Thursday on Pasolini that looks like it's really.
Who are the participants? Do you know?
Oh, with my reading
That's
glasses.
always a good question.
It's always a good question.
I may not know them, but it's a good question.
Okay, let's see. Oops, come on. Panel featuring Evan Calder Williams, Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, David Forgax,
He's pretty smart.
F-O-R-G-A-C,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Professor and Chair, Department of Italian Studies, NYU. Ara Mergian, Associate Professor, Department of Italian Studies, NYU. Luca Peretti, Visiting Professor in Italian, Ohio State University. Karen Pincus, Professor of Italian and Comparative Lit,
Yeah,
Cornell.
she's pretty smart too.
Karen Raisin,
Okay.
R-A-I-Z-E-N.
So we can get it online, Casa Italiana,
Um,
Thursday night, right? We have,
Well, it's you can get it in person.
No, I meant we can find out.
Oh, you can find out. Yeah.
That's what I meant,
No.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay.
Yeah, what time is it? Oh my gosh.
Well, he was someone that was
6:30,
always going
6:30,
against
6:30.
dominant ideology and party ideology,
In every way,
Pasolini,
Yeah,
and
he's great.
another strange relationship to the Communist Party. So, right,
Thank
okay,
you.
okay.
Yeah, so anyway, it's on 12th Street, and I guess it's 6:30, so,
Oh, NYU Casa.
NYU Casa
Okay,
Italiana,
that's
yeah.
Columbia.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
No.
downtown.
Downtown.
Okay, thanks for coming.
But
We'll see you.
is it possible to say just very quickly what the issue was with Foucault disliking Poulantzas?
Oh, I think he didn't like the philosophy, the whole notion of class, the conception of class, and that Poulantzas was a very militant, Marxist, and Foucault had strange relations with with Marxists in general. I mean, he was very close to Marx in some ways, in terms of his analyses. I mean, I think you could make a case and, write a pretty good book on, Foucault and Marx being, quite close in terms of some of their research and what their mistakes were. And Foucault certainly to the Frankfurt School, very, very close to the Frankfurt School in the 40s and the 50s. But there seemed to be a really strange relationship with those people that wanted to continue with categories of class, and these kind of things, and political power. I think there was an argument about power. Poulantzas was a little more concrete about class fraction and the creation of political power, and whereas Foucault, seemed to be more abstract and more, and more local too. Poulantzas is again coming out of a longer tradition. So I mean, there are many levels, but I'm sure there was a person out. I'm sure they said Poulantzas, knowing him, who was not the sanest of persons either, maybe said something in the hallway, that didn't go digest well, or Foucault, who was not known to niceties, maybe said something to Poulantzas. Who knows? I really don't know, but I just base it on ideas here.
Are we meeting next week?
I'll send out an email. It'll be either next week or the following week.
I can make it next week.
Okay. I'll have either the 20. February 9th or the 16th. Yeah. So anyway, let me run through this a little bit quicker. So we have the analysis of the conjuncture, etc. The question of the lag time and the continents and the regions that I mentioned earlier, page 173, 74, 75, very important. To see how he articulates this. And he has a very good example, page 173. I mean, a radically new science founded in a new, previous, unexplored continent. For example, geometry, founded by the Greeks, Thales and others. Physics, founded by Galileo, or history, founded by Marx. In each of these three instances, the new science has opened up a new continent of reality to knowledge. Not reality, but reality to knowledge. A continent was independent of the other already explored continents. Once this new continent is opened up by the new science, other sciences can appear in it, one after another. They explore regions of the continent. And this is very much a kind of mirror of phenomenology, looking at regional ontologies, right? That phenomenology is very well aware the origin of geometry, Husserl, for example, right? etc. The origin of arithmetic, Husserl again, right? Mathematics, right? What he does with Galileo and the crisis for European sciences. Yeah. So anyway, all right, for example, experimental chemistry founded by Lavoisier is clearly a new science, yet it does not open up a new continent, but merely occupies a region within the continent of physical nature opened up by Galileo's discovery, a region hitherto that was unexplored by scientific knowledge. So in the case of these regional sciences, the law which states that philosophy lags behind the new science does not apply if the essentials of the philosophy called for by the new regional science were produced after the foundation of the science that opened up the new continent, right? Okay, so the empirical history of theories verifies this law. He goes into, these moments in the Greek, right? With Descartes, Malebranche, Leibniz, Kant, others, Lavoisier, and then Marx and Engels' scientific discovery was subject to the same law. Then he goes through the German ideology, right, as the fundamental text for the birth of historical materialism, which I recommend if you haven't read, and I would read it in the International Publishers edition because it's very truncated by the Chris Arthur paperback edition. Get the volume, I think it's volume 5 of the International Publishers edition, the German ideology. Very, very, very good, edition, right? Okay. Philosophy must be surely and simply abolished. This is the first that Marx calls for that, the abolishment of philosophy, whereas the future of philosophy is what Feuerbach is producing. Marx wants an abolition, right? But, this is interesting, not that it may be realized as he maintained as the humanist Marx, but in order to make it possible to take the study of positive things. So going back, and I'm sorry that it takes so long to get here, I should have mentioned this when Beth and other people and David were raising these questions about the humanistic and the lack of the use of the word alienation and other words. What he's really talking about here is what Marx does. He wants to undertake the study of positive things, right? In other words, how is money transformed into capital, right? What are these levels that are going on, right? And he says the philosophy is a dialectical positive empiricism followed by a historicist philosophy of the subject. Individuals are still conceived as the subjects of history, right? So then he's going to go, history is a process without a subject, right? His own definition of historical materialism. Unrelated to the dialectical materialism elaborated later, it eventually disappears. So he goes on about this. The fact that dialectical materialism lags behind historical materialism makes itself felt in the German ideology in the form of an absence of dialectical materialism. So what Althusser, I think, is claiming for himself in his school, and the task that's needed, is to build a philosophy that is adequate to the demand of capital, not to the humanistic categories. I think this is where he's going. Yeah, here. In a very hardened, right, non-flinching way. Yeah, very much. So, yeah, please.
But
yeah.
So the thing that confuses me about that, though, is
Okay, sure.
I think of Althusser as making the argument that this is what Marx is doing, rather than this is what we need to do to supplement Marx.
Right.
So, which is...
Right. Well, he's talking about what Marx is doing in the German ideology to capital, right, in order to show that there's still remnants of the humanistic, right, in this period, right?
Right, but isn't his argument that it's gone by the time we get to capital? The remnants of the humanistic
Yes,
section?
yes,
Right.
absolutely.
So it's
It's
not
gone
so much-
really in the German ideology. This is the
Right,
work of the
right.
rupture.
That's when the
Yeah,
rupture is.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but the point, it seems to me then, is
Okay.
not that we Althusser and the reading group
Right.
need to create this philosophy for Marx, but rather that it's already in Marx once we get to capital, right?
Yes, but we need to produce the theoretical concepts.
For other disciplines.
Yes. Well, no, for philosophy.
Yeah.
See, in a way, he's trying to say, look, even though Marx says philosophy should be abolished, right, we still need, quote, a Marxist philosophy, right? So he's going against Marx's pronouncement. At the same time, he wants to show that later, that's why you're reading Capital in a group, right? In a kind of reading group, to show that you can produce new theoretical concepts, right? Yeah?
Okay.
By the reading of Capital that may be already there, right? But, it's going to be stripped, if you will. He wants to take away all this overlap of the language of the Leibnizian, the Hegelian, all this. Let's produce new philosophical armature or concepts out of this. So this is the task of dialectical materialism. Historical materialism has already bequeathed to us, right, this object called capital. The object before us is capital. Right? So it's reading that object, right, in a sense that you're able to produce new concepts out of that reading, that also have the, quote, practical theoretical, that gives you not only a political line, but it's connected to movement, to revolutionary movement.
Okay.
So the revolution is the theoretical revolution that's constant. You can kind of think of it as a permanent theoretical revolution, that you're always revising, rethinking, the conceptual. Yes, always, always already. That's always going on. It's kind of like proto-deconstruction in some ways, because, no concept is safe from its contamination, right? And its use in the system, right? So there are a lot of similarities here. Yeah, please, yeah.
Doesn't he allude later on, and it's
Yeah,
the
it's
only
all right,
thing
no, it's all right.
I've read of Althusser, to using this kind of analysis for a range of different disciplines. It says it should be developed in these other areas if they're to stand the test of his way of doing science or Marxist.
Yeah, I mean, the philosopher's, task is to invent the new concepts. I mean, what philosophy does, at least according to Deleuze, and maybe going way back, to Plato and others, is that it's a producer of concepts. That's what philosophy does. That's its activity, is to produce concepts, right? In a way, yeah. And without that production of concepts and that conceptual armature, you can't have other disciplines, right?
It's
The
not-
physicists study, time and motion and matter, right? I mean, etc. But without a concept of matter, right? Without a concept of motion, right? The physicist still is sort of lost in terms of a foundation or something that we can really ultimately. This is the way he's speaking. I'm not saying that the neurologists might know much more, than the philosophers today. I'm not closed on that subject matter by any means. But this is what the philosopher does. It's going to produce new concepts. Now he's saying that since Marxist philosophy is so underdeveloped, right, we need this consistent motion of producing new theoretical concepts that are adequate to the object. How do we go about reading, the transformation problem, through production of new concepts? What's going on, right? Yeah. And how is that taken to be linked, if you will, to practico-theoretical activity, not just to simply mental masturbation, right? I mean, to be, pretty blunt about it. Yeah. Yeah. So there's always this linkage to the movement, right? That's happening. So yeah. So the regional ontologies, yeah. But he's not placing philosophy up there. He's placing philosophy down here in the reading of Capital, right? In a sense, yeah. It's not way up here just looking down. This is from below, right? What's happening below, yeah. In many ways. So like Gramsci, he's very close to Gramsci in this way, in a sense. This is a kind of radicality and a revolution from below, even though one's in jail and the other one's a full professor at the Sorbonne, right? Right, in many ways, right? So anyway, let's look at them. This may help you. 176 at the top. The lag between philosophy and science is in a particular case of the lag between theory and practice. If it is clearly stipulated that since what's involved in a science, the practice in question is a theoretical practice. Philosophy's lag behind science would be then one instance of the fundamental principle of materialism, which is the primacy of practice, right? Not the primacy of theory, the primacy of practice. So Althusser is always thinking theory as practico-theoretical activity, not as theoretico-practico activity, always, right? So it goes on, the theoretical revolution, paragraph down, 2 paragraphs down, intervenes in the continent, consists in rejecting ideological theories and replacing them with a scientific theory, right? Always the battle is against the ideological. However, since it does not explore one region of a continent whose major principles are already known, but rather opens up a new continent, how can the scientific theory come into existence? So he talks about the delivery of that baby, right? The new science resolves the contradiction in the following way. It imports a number of theoretical elements, concepts, categories, and methods into its field, barring them from existing scientific or philosophical disciplines outside that field. It puts these theoretical elements to work on the reality of the new object, yeah? And in performing this labor, it also rectifies these imported theoretical elements in order to adapt them to the reality of the new continent. So this is kind of crucial for his thinking about how one will do this practical theoretical activity, right? So then he goes on to the philosophical concept of how causality is completely changed by Galileo. What we mean by causality, right? What we mean by causality. I mean, what do we mean by oligarchs today isn't what oligarchs mean in the ancient world. You have to look at how these, transformations take place. What concepts are we looking at? You know, what does 1% really mean? You know, in a sense, I have a bone to pick there. You know, it's much less than the 1% that control things. You know, 1%'s much too generous. That's 3.5 million
Like
people.
Owen.
They're not 3.5 million people making decisions on the future of the planet here. The 3.5 million refers to those people with $1 million maybe in equity outside their house, but that doesn't mean they're in power. Right? Doesn't mean, yeah, that they had a seat at the big table at Davos. And Davos is just the show. That's the spectacle. You know, they don't tell you what's going on in the boardrooms, or, you know, they don't have the cameras and the press in there, right? So anyway, so he goes through this very nice thing on causality and the dialectic, and then the distortions of the Marx-Hegel moment. Okay, going on, page 180, I think this was a great phrase, a law which incurs of the first consequence, and again, this is all about the lagging behind. This is page 180, first consequence, and about the lag governing the history of scientific and philosophical theories, which explains why this lag is necessary, also helps us to understand the conditions that allow us to overcome it. And I like this phrase. It is a law which encourages, not fatalism, right, one, not repetition and resignation, but rather labor, research, and discovery. Yeah, yeah. LRD. New acronym. Such labor is indispensable to rectify theoretical distortions, both ideological, practical, produced by the lag. The second effect would be always the effect, the consequence, the effects of the new political and ideological conjuncture. So he goes on the new disciplines, going back to what you said, Chris. Among these disciplines, let me mention in particular the beginning of a true history of the sciences, top of page 181, a truly historical epistemology. Now you can ask the question, does someone like Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I don't know if you're familiar with this, or the Copernican Revolution, or the Essential Tension, any of these books, is Kuhn part of this, or is Kuhn doing something different with a paradigm shift? Does Althusser have something else in mind in terms of a truly historical epistemology?
I mean,
The production of
Althusser
that.
seems to me the opposite of Kuhn.
Yes,
at least
I
at
agree.
first,
Go ahead.
because, you know,
Yeah.
for Kuhn, the whole point is that you have to, a paradigm has to sort of blinker you and close you off
Right.
in a way so that you can work on the specific problems within a given
Yes.
ideological framework.
Yes.
Whereas for Althusser, science is open and ideology is what's closed.
Right, right.
So I'd say
That's
they're
right.
opposite.
So you could maybe even rephrase that Althusser would criticize Kuhn from the standpoint of the ideology of paradigmatic thinking.
Right, yeah.
And Foucault is also criticizing Kuhn through the episteme, as you know, right?
Yeah.
It's a different way of looking at knowledge production. So you have questions here around epistemology, the conditions for the production, the old Kantian problematic. What are the conditions for the possibility of knowledge? Right? So this is very interesting in this context. Okay, good. Second, the effects of the new political, and he goes on the beginnings of critical and theoretical reflections on psychoanalysis, and then third and finally, de Saussure's linguistics, the structural linguistic of de Saussure, and the distinction between the diachronic and the synchronic, and the famous proposition, language is a differential system without negative terms, which is the working proposition of the Saussurean system. Language is a differential system without positive terms. Everything cancels itself out. And of course, this is true in French. Masculine and feminine always canceling each other's out. And of course, he's Swiss French. His brother's a psychoanalyst, by the way, Raymond de Saussure of the Swiss school. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So it goes on the ground in its own fashion. There's a category of causality. The backwardness about this, that Marxist philosophy is the site of a problem, right? It is so in this sense, right? He goes on to the strategic tasks of Marxist philosophy, right? First of all, the struggle against ideological distortions. right? So then the progress of the sciences that come in within the purview of historical materialism, and then setting the houses in order of human and social sciences. Right? Good luck, etc. So the three tasks really come down to two: the defense of Marxist philosophy and science against bourgeois ideology, and the development of historical materialism and the regional sciences that depend on historical materialism by way of the reconquest and overhaul of the disciplines now dominated by bourgeoisie. And that's every discipline today. You don't have any radical disciplines or really any radical teachers. All the radicals are at the community colleges, teaching undergraduates first and second years. There are no radicals at the big research institutions, very few. Very few. The radical teaching is, and then these people are getting burned out because the kids at the community college don't read, etc. This is one awful game, this whole educational state apparatus at work. One awful game. Very sad what's going on. Okay, so then he goes into the tasks, the defense of Marxist theory against empiricism and pragmatism. He talks about Engels' anti-Düring. So he gives a lot of text that we already know and we could work with. Historicism, page 186. Again, Beth's not here. Maybe I'll write her and tell her this is the page on which historicism. Today, one of the most dangerous forms of empiricism is historicism. In other words, the idea that it is possible to know the nature of history directly, immediately, without producing the theoretical concepts indispensable to acquiring knowledge of it. A historicist interpretation of Marxism, visible in some of Gramsci's writings, consists in affirms that Marx simply historicized the results, and this is going back to what we were talking about earlier, Smith, labor theory of value, and Ricardo, right? Simply historicized the results of classical political economy, and he simply injected process or the dialectic into the old philosophical categories. So Althusser is going to claim that Marx, in terms of his reading, actually changes sites. The terrain of the reading, the site of the reading is radically changed. There's a massive displacement going on in Marx's mind and in Marx's writings. Okay, you understand this? I mean, think about it as, something that's blurred in the beginning, but then it's situated so outside the old narrative, right? Outside the old theory, right? In a way. So it makes you, refract that moment. You're not only in a reflective moment, but you're in a really massive process of refraction. Yeah, in a way. You're kind of flipping out in some ways. I mean, not, to use vernacular. It's something very unusual, because it's not part of your normal reading, or your normal thing when you're actually engaged as the producer of that reading. You don't sit down and say, well, I'm producing this book as I'm reading it. You don't really engage at that kind of level. So he's really asking us to do that. This is an extremely active, type of reading that's going on. Much more than the implied reader of Wolfgang Esser, that something's implied just has to be made explicit. He's arguing against that. Yeah, please. Yeah.
It just occurred to me
Yeah.
that sounds a lot like what Sartre was talking about with totalization, right? You're actually creating the work of art or the book or
Yes,
whatever it is.
that's right.
It doesn't
That's right.
exist outside of
That's right.
a subject creating it through
Right.
the
Right.
interpretation or
Right.
understanding.
Or you're in that process that you're actually undergoing that process.
Right.
This is what most students today are very afraid of, because once they begin to read, they think they're going crazy. It's sad. They really think they're going nuts. You can see it in their eyes when you start going, if they're, somehow, I never did this. Because of all the fixations on the screen and all these things. It's very interesting to me how this is working in the culture of education. They really think they're going mad when they start to really read. Yeah, it's a new way of seeing, a new way of new processes. Although that's the only hope we have. Yeah, is that kind of madness. What they think is madness. They're mad. I mean, they're fixated. They're fixated in madness already. Dull-edged. So he's asking, you don't inject process. The process is already there, right? In a sense, it's what as you said, the subject brings to it in a lot of ways, right? Okay. So theoretical humanism, and this page 186 is important because he takes on the concepts of historicism and the moral idealistic Marxist humanism, right? The moral idealistic interpretation of the theoretical foundations of Marxist doctrine should be precisely defined. This interpretation, and this is a very good definition, consists in substituting ideological notions for scientific concepts and philosophical categories that provide the real theoretical foundation for Marxism. The Marxist science of history takes as its theoretical foundation a system of concepts, and here we go. Mode of production, infrastructure, productive forces and relations of production, superstructure, juridical, political and ideological, social class, class struggle, and so forth. For these scientific concepts, which constitute the theoretical foundation of the science of history, theoretical humanism substitutes ideological notions. And here we go. Man, alienation, the disalienation of man, the emancipation of man, Enlightenment thinking, man's reappropriation of his species being, the whole man, and so on. In Marxist philosophy, the basic theoretical concepts are the concepts of materialism and the dialectic, the distinction between being and thought, between the real object and the object of thought, the primacy of practice, and so forth. Theoretical humanism substitutes for these concepts the ideological notions of subject and object. So you can see the antagonists here. Lukács, parts of the Frankfurt School, consciousness, phenomenology, right? Activity, act, creation, and so on. So these are, again, Marxists, as Jameson said about phenomenology, Husserl did not flinch in any of the bourgeois practices, but it's the highest form of bourgeois philosophy, right? Right. I'm not saying I agree, but that's what, yeah.
I don't think he necessarily agrees even with that statement either, because in the next page he says,
okay.
again, to reject an interpretation of Marxism as a form of theoretical humanism does not mean that the problems of individuality or subjectivity are foreign to Marxist theory.
They're subordinate. Though.
Or, they're subordinate.
Yeah,
so
he's not eliminating all
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that distinction we missed so far, actually.
Okay.
Because he's just saying that they're subordinate to these other outside scientific
Yes,
theories.
but again, in terms of the building of the theory, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think in terms of the building of the theory, he wants to kind of bypass this, right?
Mm-hmm.
In such a way to make it so subordinate that we don't let that get in the way.
Yeah.
If we say, oh man, right, oh alienation, oh exploitation, these kind of things, we're getting back into that trap, and we're not staying at the level that he wants us in terms of theory construction, without theoretism taking over. So he's guarding against, I think here, theoretism. But go ahead, talk about it.
For militancy,
I mean, I'm trying
ultimately,
to,
I think
what's
that's
that, I'm sorry?
for militancy. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
sort
of
of
course.
that's what I was
Of
trying to
course.
say about
Yeah.
that I say in the beginning is I think
Yeah.
he's hedging against this kind of counter-revolution, this kind of sending back to these humanisms ultimately.
Yes, well, the subordinate clause,
Right.
in a way. Yeah, we remember that back in the days of the dinosaurs, right? Yeah, something like that, I think, in some ways. I mean, he's not really trying to take away all this in terms of, the things that you can't discuss. That's not the question. There's not a censorship at work here.
Mhm.
There's actually a development of, like, these have no place in terms of the invention of the new concepts that the continent demands.
Yeah.
That's what he's really saying here. On another level, yes, we can talk about creativity. And, I got a lot of friends that say creativity is a bourgeois concept, don't use it, this kind of stuff, in a way. So, I mean, I understand, what you're saying here very, very well. On the other hand, it's important to remember that, again, he's making the case that philosophy is about, building theories. It's about theory, construction, and it is the invention of new concepts that he's looking at here, right? So he goes on to the concepts of individuality, subjectivity, the human person, and so on, a fortiori, the notions of man, moral, subject, creative freedom, creation of man, so forth, have no legitimate claim to being the theoretical concepts on which Marxist theory is based, but subordinate. So I'm glad, I'm really glad you pointed this out, because this is important. Subordinate rather than vital, right?
Yeah.
To the construction.
Yeah.
Okay? So, when one presents them as the theoretical basis, one inevitably lapses into a petty bourgeois moral or religious ideology, anterior and foreign to Marxism. One he had to break with in the German ideology, the settling of accounts, which is the famous saying, I'm going to settle accounts with my erstwhile philosophical consciousness. Right? Yeah, and that. Okay? Then the evolutionist tendency. Not only the humanist, right? So the antagonists now are the evolutionist, right? The humanist, right? The historicist. These are all antagonists to Marxist philosophy in terms of the base, the theoretical foundation, right? And again, he's not, to me, there's no softness here. This is not an example of the left is too soft. This is, why so hard, said the charcoal to the diamond, right? Anyway, very hard-edged, very uncompromising, etc. Right? So basically, this is the Marx, the finalist teleological schemas. This is the evolutionist, Spennerian, and it goes through, Darwinian biology, and an example in Plekhanov, page 188. He's going through the history of Marxist evolutionism, and he traces this from Plekhanov to Bernstein. Which is interesting. Yeah, which Lukács would agree with him on this. In terms of the critique of evolutionist, stuff. So,
But not teleological, though. I mean,
not
Lukács is
teleological.
Totally teleological.
Yes, no, that's right. Right. Yes, that's right. Yes, Lukács is teleological, which is part of the problem. I mean, really part of the problem. Yeah. And part of the problem of the basically the whole Third and Fourth International in some ways. Yeah, in some ways was the teleological
The
nature.
Fourth International was Trotsky's one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In what sense teleological? I mean,
That somehow the proletariat is the subject of history.
Oh, you mean,
And-
that's what I meant by
Yeah, that's what he's, in terms of Lukács, yeah. If there's an eschatology here, there's an apocalyptic thinking that somehow this is it. The day of reckoning is when the proletariat finally takes the means of production, takes control of the, it'd be a nice day. But, after that, it would be, you have to start talking about workers' co-ops and, what kind of democratic procedures on the shop floor and the production apparatus. So anyway, okay. The outmoded page 189, there's a theoretical reason for ideological distortions of Marxism. What was long exposed interpretations of Marxism to the influence of empiricism, evolutionism, or humanistic idealism for within the workers' movement is, from a theoretical standpoint, the unprecedented nature of the theoretical revolution carried out by Marx. Right? So very, very, very interesting here that, that Marx has taken upon himself, it has happened, that against the positivistic, the empirical, and the historicist, all of which still are with us all the time. How many times do we have to hear about Black History Month? Every day is Black History. Yeah, think about all this historicist stuff that frames up our daily discourse, right? Yeah, etc. Right? The empirical. This happened on this day. Right? Etc. So he's really, he's really hard at work here in terms of what is theory, what role does theory play in Marxist philosophy, and how do you really build, quote, the elements towards a Marxist philosophy. This is 67, remember, 22 years out of being empirical about it. But anyway, 2 decades after World War II, right, where the party, the PCF, has had some successes, a little bit of moment in the elections, etc. He's trying to, again, set this aright, going forward. Okay, so take 3 examples at the bottom of the page of the reading. Marxists who read and spontaneously interpret Marxist theory without difficulties, scruples, or hesitation within the schemas of empiricism, evolutionary humanism, in fact declare that Marx contributed nothing new to philosophy and by implication to science. These Marxists reduce the prodigious philosophical novelty. And this is an interesting question. What is the philosophical novelty that he speaks of here, right? To existing ordinary obvious forms of thought, that is, to the forms of the dominant philosophical ideology. In order clearly to perceive and grasp the revolutionary novelty of Marxist philosophy and its scientific consequences, and necessarily lucidly to resist this ideological reduction, to combat the bourgeois philosophical ideology that supports it, and to state what distinguishes the specificity of Marxist thought, where it makes it revolutionary, not only in political practice, but also in theory. This is where the ultimate difficulty lies. For it is not easy to break with self-evident truths of theoretical ideologies such as empiricism, evolutionism, and humanism, which have dominated all of Western thought 200 years. It's easy to say Marx was not an empiricist, Marx was not Hegelian, Marx was not theoretical. Not easy to show positively how Marx, because he is not Hegelian, evolutionist, humanist, empiricist, is something else entirely, something which must then be defined. And when one tries to show this, it's not easy to make people acknowledge and accept it because the resistances are extremely powerful. Okay? So again, this kind of almost psychoanalytic approach that people will hang on, cling all the time to these previous notions of what is Marx, right, etc., right? Okay, because it is theoretical revolutionary, inevitably contains the fundamental difficulty. Unless we can able to cede to the false self-evidence of the dominant theoretical ideologies, whether we mean empiricism, evolution, humanism, or other forms of idealism, and thus betray what is most precious in Marxist thought, that is to say, what makes it theoretically revolutionary, we must confront this difficult struggle against the ideology that threatened to suffocate, reduce, and destroy the Marxist thought. There's no imaginary difficulty. This is no imaginary difficulty. It's an objective historical difficulty, and so real in its way as the difficulties of revolutionary practice. The earth, or the structure of society, does not rise on new foundations as easily as much supposed, neither does the system of thought. Echoes of Descartes here. I'm going to put up a new foundation for, so this part of the tradition of writing repeats itself too, in some ways. We know a revolution has to take place before the rise on new foundations, but after the revolution, and again, this is the famous thing that after the revolution, ideology remains. Of Althusser. We must be waged in politics and ideology to establish, consolidate, and ensure the victory of the new society. The same goes for the system of thought, etc., etc. So anyway, the long struggle forward. Okay. On page 193, the fundamental problems urgent for Marxist philosophy to explore mention the following. The problem of the specificity of philosophy as opposed to science. What does philosophy do that science doesn't? Heidegger says science does not think, which is interesting. Heidegger sets up this opposition between thinking and knowing. It's very interesting, for our time, Yeah, and he asked the question, what does it mean to think? And we really haven't started to think. So in some ways, again, you can see this influence, happening on Althusser. The problem of the nature of theory, the problem of practice and the specificity of the various practices, that is economic, political, and theoretical, and the problem of the specificity of the Marxist, as opposed to the Hegelian dialectic. The problem of the Marxist conception of causality, the nature of ideology, and so on. Long arguments, etc., but we gain in some sense of its importance and urgency, right, from a rapid examination, that is the union of theory and practice. So he's going to concentrate on this here to show the difficulty there is, it's not simple to be a Marxist in philosophy, which, is a slogan of this thing, okay? So he'll go through this, how do you develop, right, historical materialism, right? And again, he becomes schematic in the terms of the reading of Capital. We have in Capital a theory of the capitalist mode of production, right? Marx has researched this, and then he will present it first through the commodity as form, right? He begins with the commodity as form. Althusser again put it aside. We're going to go straight to the chapter, or the section on money and the transformation into capital and what that means. Anyway, the theory of the capitalist mode of production, we have nothing comparable for the other modes of production, that is pre-capitalist or socialist, or from phases of transition between these modes, right? If we possess an impressive conceptual system for thinking the reality of the economic level, we have no comparable theory for thinking the reality of its political and ideological levels. So this is again why phrases such as the 1%, the haves and the have-nots, the 26 billionaires that have, 1/2 of the globe's wealth versus the 3.8 million people who have the other for 50%. What is all this about? This really doesn't amount to much in terms of theory and thinking about where we really are. I mean, it's just the capitalist book of facts, if you want, instead of Ridley's whatever, book of strange occurrences. Anyway, as far as the political, we have general theses, but etc. But we have no rigorous developed theory of the nature of social classes, state power, state apparatus, bureaucracy, etc. The difference between class and its representatives, all these things. Then he's going to talk about the question of the theoretical lacuna. What is happening, right? What happens in history? The history, right? Who work on the past, slave-holding feudal soul formations, like the ethnographers and ethnologists, who are today working on primitive soaps, suffer from the effects of the theoretical inadequacy of their own work. They encounter them in the form of problems involving the nature and the role of institutions and ideologies of these social formations, or the determination of the dominant element in the dialectic of their history or their non-history. So political labor come up against the practical consequences of this theoretical deficiency. This is why a guy like Cory Booker, think about this, can go back to New Jersey, open up a campaign for the presidency near a housing project which he helped, right, in some ways, because we don't have a theoretical moment to understand why, not only when he's doing this for show and support and all this and going back to his past, but what does this really mean, right, ultimately in terms of the determinant elements? What is this really going to mean going forward? How predictable can this become, too? This is another aspect, right, in a sense. So the historians and them aren't going to really talk this way about this as a dominant structure or a structure of dominance. They're going to just talk about it. This is where Cory started, so like Obama. Never of the question of the ideology. Obama ran against Bobby Rush, another brother, a Black Panther. Should have known about Obama from day one. He goes in, his first political race is against Bobby Rush, an ex-Black Panther, member of the House of Representatives. He got slaughtered because it was Bobby Rush's district. But just to have the nerve to run against someone so advanced, right? I mean, Bobby Rush was smart, you know, yeah. Congress. I guess you don't know this, right? They never really played this up in the media, that this was Obama's first campaign, you know, et cetera, and you knew exactly where he stood on the race question.
Yeah.
Knew exactly where he stood. There's no militancy here, nothing going on, that he was one of them, yeah. And you think they're gonna talk about the Booker of Baraka, moments in Newark, or this kind of stuff, and what he did in Newark? Yeah. With all due respect to Rosario Dawson, yeah, in this case, yeah. Sin City. You seen the movie? Sin City? Yeah, she's in it, she's the head prostitute in the Gold Zone, yeah. She used to like Boots Riley, she was doing better but I guess, power, anyway. All right, so, I guess what we're really trying to get here is that, capitalist capital, he pays on 197, going back again to another question here. Capital gives us all we need to construct such a theory, a mode of production. What is it, right? So as you were saying, that the concepts are already in Marx, right? And from those concepts, we can construct a theory, right? And we can produce the new continent of theory. So, when Balibar writes the basic, and I don't think it's a great piece, he writes basic problems in modes of production and historical materialism. He concentrates on mode of production, right, in this thing. You can see it at work in some of their theorizing, what they're doing. Again, not foolproof, this is not the end-all to be-all, but it's a part of a very interesting moment in the attempt to build towards a Marxist philosophy. I think, one of the more creative ways. Lefebvre in a very different way.
Yeah,
Very
it's
different,
yeah.
very different praxis and poesis, a very different openness. Althusser, again, is struggling within the party, right?
Yeah.
And outside it. Also struggling within the institutions, as well as trying to get outside the institutions. So there's a very different level of encounter going on. All right. I want you to keep that in mind.
For sure.
Productive forces, etc. And again, what is really meant here in terms of the relations and the forces of production? What is that really doing to our social relations? And what kind of concepts do we have? I mean, we have Bernard Stiegler, who will say that this is so out of whack now. All we have is, the automated society. Simondon, man is machine, a kind of return of mechanical materialism. So we have this also going on in France at the same time that plays out very much today, in artificial intelligence, man is a machine, et cetera, et cetera.
And it,
Yeah.
the military is financially supporting a lot of research in that area, which is what that book is partly about that I
You mean Jonathan
emailed
Prairie's
about.
book on 24/7?
No, this one is.
About the
one
White Sparrow?
I just emailed you this yesterday, so maybe you
Okay,
have a chance to
I
look at
did,
it.
yeah.
But it's looking at termites, which is what.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I looked at that. Yeah.
But the military is financially supporting quite a bit of research.
Okay, so we
on
go from
termites.
the White Sparrow that can stay up 9 days or 7 days if they're studying for cyber soldiers, right? Now the termites, which I guess has something to do with military application, right? I'm sure, yeah. No, that's another thing that's completely under-theorized. I mean, there are a few people that do this, but, you used to have research, what are people doing with DARPA and all these kind of moments at this point? We really don't have that kind of stuff out there. We talk a lot about climate change and have a lot of experts, but nobody's talking about what's new in the defense industry, what's going on, or how the Russians have weapons systems that are maybe superior right now, at least in terms of helicopters and ground-to-air missile capture. So who knows? Who knows what's going on with the Trump? That's another thing. We're in this floating abstraction, how stupid he is. We're going to hear this. But what's the real reason behind this? What is the military thinking? Because I don't think the military would let him get away with it unless there's something at stake here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they think he's that crazy. Destroying a treaty with Russia written during the Gorbachev era. Yeah. I mean, Putin had no problem retaliating by saying, yeah, great, we're with you on that, so we'll do the same. So you have to ask, what were the terms there that were, producing? Yeah,
Well, part of it, I think, is just that, people see money in it, I mean.
they see what?
They see money in it.
Oh, they see money, okay, the new military,
Sure, yeah.
sure.
You gotta take all the old systems and, throw them away and build new systems.
Right, okay. Yeah,
What's the point he's making? I couldn't quite understand his language about personality cult. Where
that's
you,
Stalin.
what?
Stalin. The
And
cult
what-
of personality is a reference to Stalin.
And
Remember, he actually wrote a piece on the 20th Congress, Althusser. This is a person that really knows Communist Party history and Communist theory history. I mean, this is someone that's, immersed, very much so,
I'm
very
just
much.
not familiar with this part of history, so what is his take on this?
Well, the cult of personality is not especially a good thing. I mean,
So he is-
he's not a Stalinist.
Yeah,
Yeah, although he's been accused of that.
yeah.
And
he in fact is not.
sometimes, it's not the worst thing to evoke in a struggle, right? In some ways, old Uncle Joe. Yeah, I have a friend that used to have a photograph of Stalin. He kept on his bed mantel and said, everybody used to have this in their place. The great leader was always watching. He goes on. This is an Italian communist, who actually gave me Negri's book on the Gregories. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So the lag time is very important. Yeah, and then the Marxist whole totalization, page 201, kind of gives you his idea of the difference between structural causality and expressive causality. This is very important. Page 200, 201, 202, up to the human sciences. This is his distinction he makes between two new philosophical categories: structural causality and overdetermination. Page 200. So structural causality is meant to draw attention to the fact that the classic philosophical category of causality, whether it's linear causality in Descartes, Leibnizian expressive causality, is inadequate for thinking the scientific analysis of capital. Even though we have this in our accumulated knowledge, our method of research, it's no longer adequate to its object. The Leibnizian expressive causality, nor the linear causality of Descartes. So the period of rationalism, right, or philosophical rationalism, is not adequate here, right? There's a different reason. And by the way, Lacan, and I think maybe we'll read this if I can get it in English, Reason After Freud. How reason is really rethought by the psychoanalytic tradition is very much along these lines too. I think they have a lot of similarity in the two domains. Okay, and must be replaced by a new category. To give some sense of innovation, we can say that in a structural causality we find something that resembles the problem, often evoked by biologists, of the causality of the whole upon its parts, with the difference that the Marxist whole is not a biological, organic whole, but a complex structure, right? That itself contains structured levels. This is structural Marxism, a good definition, working definition. The infrastructure, the superstructure. Structural causality designates the very particular causality of a structure upon its elements, of a structure upon another structure, or the structure of the whole on its structural levels. Okay? So this is a working definition of what he's going to use outside that of linear and expressive causality, against the Cartesian and the Leibnizian notions of causality. This is structural causality, where the structure of the structure is a whole that acts upon the structure and structural levels. So these are levels. I mean, maybe one way of looking at this is levels. He's very into Spinoza's levels of not knowing, very much. He cites this in Positions actively. Okay, overdetermination, on the other hand, designates one particular effect of structural causality, particularly the one I evoked a moment ago with the theory of social classes. The conjunction of different determinations on the same object. So a system of multiple determinations is probably the way, acting in accordance on the same object. And the variations in the dominant element among these determinations within that very conjunction. We might say that social classes are overdetermined since in order to grasp their nature, we have to mobilize the structural causality of three levels of society to understand class: economic, political, and ideological, with structural causality operating in the form of a conjunction of these structural determinations on the same object and in the variation of the dominant element within this conjunction. He didn't claim that this is said, but they're part of a process, right? These are not adequate. He's always careful. He always is. He pulls in the humble card at a certain moment, right? Okay, so I would say that, to kind of get Althusser here, and for those of you interested, Fred Jameson's The First Section of the Political Unconscious, a meditation on interpretation, has a long section on structural causality. Okay, so if you want to look at that, you might, get a different take than, Althusserian just its moment. He's going to expand upon that consistently, as well as overdetermination, which is a Freudian. The dream is always overdetermined, its elements. This is from Freud. Surdetermination, yeah, right? Overdetermination. Okay, so this is then he goes on to the human science. How do we enter into the human sciences? One of the important thing, page 206, the reader will have understood that in setting out his program, and he's looking at the program of historical materialism, right, in the institutions. I am by no means calling for a return to dogmatism. The point is not all problems have been solved in advance by Marxist theory. Okay? So all true because it's all powerful because it's true is, in some ways it's certainly not all powerful because it solved everything. They do, so we can retreat back to Marx. There do indeed exist new problems about which Marx said nothing. New disciplines, such as linguistics and psychoanalysis. He'll go back to what he said earlier, de Saussure, and of course, Freud and Lacan, which he wrote an essay on. These regions do not belong directly or exclusively to historical materialism. They also seem to belong to other continents, or perhaps to one other continent. The question remains open. Has Freud's Copernican revolution about the subject, and the ego is not master in its own house, which is another way of saying history is a process without a subject. You could begin to kind of think that parallel, in some ways. So, the true Marx, in order to progress, in order to become the strategic center of the general theory, right, on which the research depends. So anyway, this is, again, a long plea, initially intended to go to the Soviet Union, right, as a new research program, becoming a new program in the French university, of which both Foucault and Derrida respond to. So if I can historicize, in that way, be a bit historicist about it, it is really his intention to develop the coming program in philosophy, through a Marxist lens. So there are many things here. I mean, we really, we can always go back and you can think it through. I always find it's good to, I know we're always on limited time, but it's always good to read these things at least twice, to think it through. And I'm trying to give, just some parameters and, markers to engage. If Marxism remains open to all that is new, And this is a very, very good moment. I mean, I like this open Marxism, the new Om, if we're going to do yoga, open Marxism, Om, we'll begin the classes, Om. Yeah, anyway, open to all real problems while at the same time remaining constantly alert to the danger represented by temptations and traps of bourgeois ideology and effect. One can acquit itself of this historical task. It can acquit itself of this historical task whose theoretical and practical and therefore political importance is obvious. Marxists have to stick to the positions of Marxist theory without retreating behind Marx into bourgeois, petty bourgeois idealist ideologies, as is so often the case with those of them who go hunting for the solution to the problems of the 20th century in the works of the early Marx. And he'll make this always clear in his writings. He wants this divide between 1845, the German ideology. I want to emphasize again what he calls the epistemological break, that Marx is beginning to produce a new continent, a new inquiry into knowledge production, right? Versus that epistemological break is on the way to the mature Marx. So he really wants to separate out this early Marx and the Marx, going back to what we read, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the Lukácsian commentary on that, the Korschian commentary, the Marcusian commentary. All of these things are part of the commentary on the humanistic Marx. This is the Althusser, why people were very alienated by him. People thought he was, anti-Marxist, too academic, etc., etc. But a lot of this is interesting in terms of how does one develop a new program. To me, this is the important part. The program is pro-writing, gramme program comes from the Greek for the writing of, this new coming program in philosophy or this new coming program in foundational knowledge, So this is what he's doing. So he concludes with a relationship between philosophy and politics. For those of you who are interested, I think the interesting parallel reading here would be Badiou on philosophy and politics, in the book called Metapolitics by Badiou. I think it's called Metapolitics. I'll check it on them. I'm pretty sure I'm right at that. So, yeah. So, again, he'll go through philosophy as changing the ensemble, if you look at page 212, for example, in this chapter, one can form a schematic idea of the specific nature of philosophy as opposed to all the other sciences by noting, for example, that it does not take as its object, as all the sciences do, a region of reality, or even the whole set of regions comprising a continent of reality, in the sense I gave that word earlier. Quite to the contrary. Philosophy takes as its object what is traditionally and improperly called the totality of the real. To put it more precisely and escape the religious dogmatic effects of the concepts of totality, let me say that philosophy takes as its object, and this is interesting, the tendential law, the law of the transformation of a complex ensemble, a group, set relations. Ensemble is also set in French, where Badiou gets the set theory, constituted by the articulation of two great systems that are themselves internally complex and articulated. One, the system of theoretical practices, or the systems of the regions and continents explored by scientific knowledge. In other words, the system of the sciences in their relation to ideologies, which they must combat in order to exist and develop, and two, the system of the different social practices, that is the economic, the political, and the ideological, which condition the existence, practice, and development of the sciences. The nature of this complex ensemble, the tendential law of transformation governing it, constitutes the specific object of philosophy, the object of which philosophy provides knowledge in the form of philosophical knowledges, the philosophical categories which are distinct from all possible scientific concepts, the categories of materialism and dialectic. You don't hear, science speak materialism or dialectic, right? These are philosophical concepts, together with all the categories subordinate to these two basic categories, materialism and dialectic, right? Hence, philosophy as dialectical materialism. He's going to try to perform that corrective, if you will. And again, I know you probably, have you read Dialectics of Nature, any of you? Engels? Yeah, I mean, obviously this is one of the confrontations, here too, which Sartre actually goes through in the first volume of the Critique of Dialectical Reason. When we talk about this complex ensemble, we do not exclude philosophy at every moment in the transformation of this ensemble. The existing philosophy also features in it in the system of theoretical practices. In stipulating that philosophy takes as object not only the nature of the complex ensemble, but also the tendential law. This is important. Philosophy is taking both the complex ensemble, right, and its nature, the essence, if you will, or, in the German sense of becoming, substance, right, but also the tendential law of transformation going. We're not merely adding a detail, we're stating an essential thesis, namely that this ensemble is caught up in a process of development with the result that historical events in the full sense of the word occur there, affecting sometimes the first system, at other times the second, and at other times the link between them. So both the theoretical practices, sometimes the social practices. So this is a good way of looking at a lot of movements, right, in a sense today, I think. Right? We must affirm that knowledge of this ensemble is knowledge of the historical law that governs it. To produce knowledge, then, philosophy of this ensemble cannot just draw up a balance sheet. It cannot be a mere encyclopedia, as certain of Engels' formulations might lead us to think, a summa of the scientific knowledge as existing in a given moment. Philosophy has to take into consideration the fact that it, too, is included in the summa in the guise of an active force or intervention within it. We must recognize the significance of its own presence in any possible summa, the fact that the presence of philosophy in any summa of scientific knowledge is the proof in actuality of the unstable, that is, historical and dialectical nature of the state of the sciences, of which philosophy can only speak only by intervening, by taking an active part, that is in the broad sense, by intervening in it politically. So he's always looking at the political line, the theoretical, social practices, and where the moment of intervention is, right? And that philosophy is already included in this kind of summa. Again, the method of research could be part of that summa, right? Versus that of the method of presentation. And he's always going through these levels in terms of a theoretical construction. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind. Okay, so anyway, then he goes on to the specific object of philosophy, the system of social practices. Politics is indeed, and all the leaders of the mind, a summary or digest of all the social practices. Interesting, huh? A digest or summary of all social practices. This is from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and leaders of the Marxist workers' movement. The state of the class struggle provides, in the form of a summary, a theoretical and practical view of the state, of the relations between the practices that condition the system of the sciences, its current existence, and its development. However, the role of pertinent index that politics plays in the system in social practice does not in this form concern philosophy as such, because politics in this sense is the object of the Marxist science of history. What directly concerns philosophy is the articulation of the system of theoretical practices within the system of social practices. Right? How does this come about? Right? It is at this precise point that philosophy is, in the strong sense, the pertinent index for the deciphering of the tendential law of transformation that regard. So he speaks in Marxist language here, in some ways. He's appropriating some of Marx, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, right, etc. And then the system of theoretical practices, science, philosophy, and ideology, in a way, education. What else is education between science, philosophy, and ideology when you really begin to think about this? If there's theory at work in any practice, say you're going to be a physical therapist, you need to know the theory of the body. What are you practicing on? This is philosophy at work, right? I mean, in terms of a basic, the basic education. How does this play out in terms of systems of representation, right? Remember, this is a method of presentation, not a method of representation. Representation is ideology. Marx is trying to get away from ideology, right? Very, very careful in this regard, right? No accident, he tells the French, take your time. Take your time. Maybe that's why Althusser says, well, we're not going to take our time. We'll forget book 1, chapters 1 through 6, right? The commodity form. Anyway, so this is very important to see, the notion of the pertinent index. What really matters? And he's using index here in the sense of Frege, the indexical signs. That you have a material location. This is part of language, etc. And reference and and language, right? This is a referential system at work at that level. All right. So so page 217. The thesis of the political nature of philosophy must be quite the opposite of a pragmatic thesis. For centuries, philosophy was the handmaiden of religion, and in the guise of modern idealism still is today. There can be no question whatsoever of perpetuating the idealist tradition by making philosophy the handmaid of politics, even if what is involved is correct politics. That is to say, there is no question. Can be no question of reducing philosophy to the rank of a commentary or the political decisions of the day, or even of a correct political line. Okay, this is interesting when someone says, what's your political philosophy? To Althusser, bad question, right? Bad question, right? So, as well as just doing commentary, which is what most of us do. I mean, like it or not, we're still doing commentary on a lot of things out here. He's asking for something much more. He's asking for the production of new concepts. All right, so that would make philosophy a political ideology, and to reduce it to the existing political ideology. Political ideology has its rights. It is indispensable to the political struggle. But philosophy is not a political ideology. It is a discipline at the theoretical level is absolutely distinct from political ideology and has the autonomy of the discipline of a scientific character. Its development is subject to specific imperatives, and these are good. Precision, conceptual rigor, demonstrative systematicity. 3 things that philosophy needs to do well, right? Precision, conceptual rigor, and demonstrative systematicity. It meets a requirement that is fundamental to any theoretical discipline of a scientific character, which must provide the knowledge of its own object in person, not of another object that is not its own. The object of philosophy is not politics, but philosophy is political by nature. Interesting. Philosophy cannot be faithful to its own object in nature unless it thinks its object. And again, he repeats, he loves this this new term he came up with that he probably saw in a student paper. Anyway, the tendential law governing the articulation of the complex ensemble of social practices and theoretical practices. This is a good way of thinking, I think, in a way, in terms of a dialectical relation of social practices and theoretical practices. It's very interesting to think this way. This is, again, 67. Philosophical, and assumes its nature philosophically. That is, unless it ensures the primacy of the class struggle within philosophy itself in forms that are rigorously and specifically philosophical. Now this begins Althusser on another journey, and this is important, that for him philosophy is always class struggle. This is what's going on as well. So he does have a notion of philosophy as class struggle. The class struggle is taking place not only on the streets, not only in the yellow vest, a class struggle is taking place in theory. This is one of his contributions. That, theory, writing, and writing theory, writing, quote, creatively, if you will, is part of, the class struggle and exemplifies something. Right? So he is going to go there. Okay, so we need the primacy of the political in philosophy itself, the specifically philosophical theoretical requirements that this primacy be treated philosophically. Marxism can run into lagging into two problems, and he's concluding here: theoretism, which completely ignores the class struggle, or pragmatism, which completely ignores the specificity of theory and philosophy as well as its scientific requirements. To develop Marxist philosophy is therefore an extremely arduous task because it requires a very high level of political consciousness and philosophical work. It requires that one respects philosophically, and this is where he says that in philosophy, the primacy of the class struggle, while avoiding the pitfalls of theoretism on the one hand and pragmatism on the other. Right? That the tasks are demanding ones, that they call for deep awareness, great critical lucidity, etc., unyielding ready. None of this can intimidate us. On the contrary, it should show us what we have to do. So he's setting forth, obviously, the task, and this goes without saying. Any political activist who has an experience of scientific practice in one capacity or another, a political capacity included, is aware of this challenge and of the necessity and fecundity of this task. It must meet the same challenge if they wish to produce a Marxist philosophy equal to its historical task in the present conjunction. So he goes through Marx here, is right at the entrance to science as at the entrance to hell, where every beginning is difficult. One must abandon all suspicion and fear. We must make no concession to the prejudice of public opinion and welcome every judgment based on scientific criticism. And then this became the watchword, especially of French Marxism and on the streets. Lenin's phrase, Marxist theory is all powerful because it is true. Right? This became a slogan-earing, moment. Yeah. So any thoughts? I mean, it's dense, it's interesting in terms of, I think, alongside of the Lefebvre, you have a beginnings of a good curriculum for the new schools, and to put us on the road to thinking, in a way. But any thoughts, any criticisms here? I mean, we certainly pick up some stuff when we go to Negri against this. Yeah.
Maybe could people just help me
Yeah,
think
sure.
about the relation in which Althusser stands to Hegel? Because it feels like all the people we've read, there's a fluidity with which Hegel runs.
There's a relation to Hegel as he got rid of Hegel very early in his career. He wrote his Doctrine d'Etat, The Spectres of Hegel, in which he talked about Hegel, the individual, the I, subjectivity, etc. Never really returned to Hegel at all, except for the few, passing remarks. And this is really a Spinozist Marxism at work, meaning that, he bypassed absolute knowing. The dialectical is a spiraling,
Right.
unfolding of circular stuff. The dialectic is much more structural, right, and about genres of knowledge, ways of knowing, than it is about unfolding of dialectical spheres of knowing.
Alf
So-
Hegman is.
Hegman is not really talked about. This is not a pious attempt to retain something. This is a revolution at work. I mean, in some ways, where you're clearing out any kind of residue to a degree. If it comes back, one of the reasons he wants to get away from the humanist, I think that this is part of a revolutionary practice. That alienation is a Hegelian, Rousseauian word. We don't need it anymore. It's not necessary in terms of our demand to build a new philosophy, a Marxist philosophy in some ways. Whereas the link between theoretical practice and social practices needs to be taken there. So it's a very long story. Althusser has an essay. I can give it to you next time I have a copy of it on Marx's relation to Hegel. You know, it's not like he denied writing about him or thinking about him. It's just that it doesn't play out at all. This is not Hegelian Marxism by any means. And the totality is spread out between the expressive totality of Leibniz, right, and the structural totality of Althusser and Spinoza. That the structure is everything, you know. This is structural Marxism, you know, yeah, and symptomatic readings. So these are some of the key phrases and the key moments. You have to understand that everything that you're reading in the world today is a symptom of the capitalist mode of production, right, in a sense. And unless we fight against that, you know, we're doing the revolution a disservice, right? You know, if we just say we can accommodate capitalism in a certain way, to the Althusserian is a ridiculous petty bourgeois, you know, thinking. Mitigation on climate change is an example of this. When you start talking about mitigation, policy will help us. We have to work with people. These are the kind of phrases that they don't like. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but this is where they're coming from, you know, in a sense. And, you know, it is a hardened form. It's a very demanding form, you know, of this kind of, to think it through. And then you have to ask yourself, is this a risk worth taking and a philosophy diving with and working with, in a sense that on the other end of this, you're not really fooled? Does this create new imaginary relationships to lived experience that Althusser thinks ideology is, the imaginary relationships one has to the society, right? Or, you know, does it critique this and really let us, you know, advance in a certain way? Is this, you know, how important does this become? So, yeah. So the relation to Hegel, yes, Hegel to him is still religious. There's a dogmatism there, you know, in a certain way. There's an eschatology. He reads Hegel as a teleological thinker, yeah, etc. There are people that try to read Hegel open-ended, but it's hard to do when you look at the phenomenology of the logic. They're really closed back on in themselves, you know. Well, I mean, where are people getting this, you know, in a sense? I mean, Marx left us open works like the Grundrisse and stuff like this. This is the stuff that Negri will pick up on, you know. It's not a closed system. You know, there's not a telos involved. There may be a telos in the way the tradition read it, that the proletariat is the exterminating angel, but Marx doesn't speak this way in his mature period. He'll talk about this in 1848 and 44 and this kind of stuff, but by 1860s, Marx is no longer really, you know, his object is capital. I mean, this is really the you know, the...
That's his fort, that's where he's strong.
Yeah. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, he's strong on everything in a lot of ways in terms of looking at the development. But yes, in the end, the mature Marx has one object before him. It's capital, right? It's the mode of production, capital, right, and all that's what he's really interested in. You know, description, analysis, synthesis, critical synthesis, and at the same time, you know, newer explanations and opening up, as you said in volume 3, is a completely unfinished work, but it leaves us a lot to work with, right? The chapter 25 through 27, fictitious capital, for example, is a good starting point, you know, for today's derivative. I mean, it's very basic, it's very underdeveloped,
So
uneven.
frustrating.
Yeah.
I wanted to do so much more with it.
Yeah. No, I know. But I mean, you know, great question. I mean, and I'll bring you, you know, he began with a thing about Hegel, right? I mean, you know, this is where he began. But they've been anti-Hegelian. Now, Balibar said, our master hid Hegel for us. We never forgave him for that. Because they wanted to read Hegel and, you know, have all this stuff. And then Macharet wrote a very good book, what is it called? Hegel or Spinoza, which pretty much sets out the positions philosophically between Marxist schools of Hegelianism and the Marxist schools of Spinoza. Yeah, Spinoza's Marxism. And Spinoza's Marxism took on a more active life in the Soviet Union than it did in the West until recently, until Negri wrote books on Spinoza, until, you know, Spinoza kind of came back around with Deleuze, Negri. You know, Spinoza really wasn't read actively during the 60s and 70s alongside Marx, not at all. It was Hegel, always Hegel. Yeah, so I mean, you know, you have to think about this too. Whereas Deleuze is giving lectures, 68 mode of expression, in expressionism in Spinoza, where he does this beautiful layout of all the ethics and the system. Lacan at 16 has Spinoza in his bedroom and is growing up as a kid, maps out the ethics. So I mean, this is a cast. It's very interesting in a lot of ways. To see it. I don't think there are any definitive answers. I think it's good to just get again thinking. I mean, this is again 50 years old what we read today. But in a way, it's still, to me, given the state of education, given the educational apparatus, still very meaningful to go back to think about how would you build a school, with Marxist philosophy. How can you use, what is its use value, if you will, at this point, for our purposes and going forward. So this, I think this is interesting. Both the situated and in its time, its stakes, right? But also what does the future have here? I think this is a good way of maybe looking at it. Yeah. Hippolyte, who's his teacher and his friend, is very much Hegelian Marxist, very much. Sorry to say Hegelian Marxist. Lukács is a Hegelian Marxist.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Marcuse has elements of Hegelian hyphen Heideggerian Marxism, as does Sartre, the Heideggerian as well. Yeah.
Adorno too, right?
Adorno's Hegelian. I mean, the Heideggerian is there, but that's his main antagonist. Yeah. I mean, yeah. They're much closer than they would like to think they are. I mean, it's kind of interesting the more you read them and how much closer they are, especially on nature, domination, these things, language to a degree, reified language. Reification interests me vis-a-vis language. Not only a reification in terms of self, but really how it's expressed in language. What is reified nature's thing? I think Josh has a copy of the book. You read it, right, on the cliche? The Function of Cliches in Modernity. It's a very good sociological study of how reified language gets to, becomes today. Yeah. Because people don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what socialism is. You see Rick Wolf, he gives it half an hour in his program to discuss what socialism is. Because he knows there's a need. I'm not saying that it's, totally the end-all to be-all in terms of definition, maybe far from it. But at least he recognizes that the word is being thrown around, but it's completely reified, it's emptied in so many ways.
Didn't you know
It's a
Obama
buzz.
was a socialist?
I did know that. I heard that from Rush Limbaugh, in a bathroom that tried to breed him as a Bolshevik. Anyway. Okay, thanks. I know we did a long time on this, but it's important stuff. And so what I'll do is I'll start with the Negri. I'll talk about the relationship between the French and the Italians. I'll try to bridge it that way, and then we'll go on to Negri with the Mulitude. I have a little thing, I prepared. I know it's no time for it, about Negri and his history and his career. To me, Negri speaks very, very actively to me, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, his stuff during that period. I think it's very rich and very interesting. And this is a person who was out there, not a professor. He was a professor.
Will you know
in
when we
terms of
meet
things.
next?
Yeah, I will.
Good.
Yeah, it'll either be next week or 2 weeks. Yeah.
Do you know when you'll know?
I hope by Monday or Tuesday. Yeah, at the latest. Yeah, I'll do it earlier this week. Yeah.